Sophie heaved the final cardboard box over the threshold of apartment 4B, letting it hit the scuffed mahogany floorboards with a resounding, dusty thud. She leaned against the heavy oak door, pushed a stray curl of hair out of her eyes, and exhaled a breath that had been trapped in her chest since she signed the lease. Welcome to Horcom After Dark. Turn down the lights, get comfortable, and prepare for stories that linger long after the screen goes dark. Let's begin. The apartment was enormous. It boasted 12-foot ceilings, original crown molding, a towering stone fireplace, and a massive bay window that looked out over a canopy of ancient elm trees. It was also undeniably, aggressively gloomy. The wallpaper, a peeling damask pattern in a sickly mustard hue, looked like it had survived the Industrial Revolution, and the air smelled faintly of dried roses and ozone. More importantly, the rent was 1/3 of the market average for the neighborhood. When the jittery landlord had handed her the heavy iron key, he hadn't made eye contact. He had simply muttered something about frequent tenant turnover and practically sprinted to his car. Sophie hadn't cared. She was a violently exhausted student surviving on instant noodles, academic spite, and a carefully curated vision board of how her life should look. She refused to let a little Gothic ambience stand between her and affordable square footage. All right, Sophie said to the empty room, her voice echoing into the shadowy corners. Step 1, exorcise the vibes. She wasn't going to let the ominous atmosphere win. Dragging her utility knife across the tape of the nearest box, she began her counter-offensive. Out came the lavender essential oil diffuser, which she immediately plugged into the wall, watching the soft stream of vapor battle the scent of century-old dust. Next came the plush, pastel pink throw pillows, tossed onto the faded velvet armchair the landlord had left behind. Her masterpiece, however, was the matcha station. She dedicated an entire corner of the kitchen counter to her bamboo whisk, her ceramic bowl, and a set of airtight glass jars filled with vibrant green powder. This was her sanctuary. This was where she would craft a soft, lo-fi aesthetic life, regardless of the fact that the apartment felt like the opening scene of a tragedy. As she was meticulously arranging her pastel pink electric kettle, the temperature in the kitchen plummeted. It wasn't a gradual chill. It was an instantaneous, bone-deep freeze that caused Sophie's breath to puff out in a white cloud. The heavy cast iron chandelier above the dining table swung violently, the glass prisms clinking together like chattering teeth. Sophie froze, her hand hovering over the kettle. Out of the corner of her eye, materialized in the reflection of the toaster, she saw her. A woman. But not a living one. The figure was entirely translucent, radiating a faint, bluish glow. She wore a high-collared, morning gown from the 1890s, her hair piled atop her head in an elegant, severe style. The ghost's face was a mask of furious, territorial rage, her dark eyes locked onto the side of Sophie's head. The phantom raised a pale, glowing hand, her mouth opening in a silent, agonizing scream that made the very air in the room vibrate with static electricity. Sophie's heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her survival instinct screamed at her to drop the kettle, run out the door, and never look back. But then, a stronger, more powerful instinct overrode her terror, the crushing weight of her financial reality. I paid first, last, and a security deposit, Sophie thought, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the counter. I am not going back to living with 3 roommates who don't know how to wash a pan. I am not losing my bay window. I am simply not doing this. Slowly, deliberately, Sophie turned away from the reflection in the toaster. She rubbed her arms, shivering exaggeratedly. Wow, Sophie said loudly, her voice trembling only slightly. The drafts in these historic buildings are absolutely out of control. I really need to email the super about weather stripping the windows. This insulation is a joke. The ghost, Lady Eleanor, though Sophie didn't know her name yet, stopped mid-scream. The phantom blinked, utterly bewildered. She lowered her hand, staring at the mortal girl, who had just blamed a localized manifestation of the undead on poor weather stripping. Sophie busied herself with unpacking a box of fairy lights, aggressively keeping her eyes forward. She could feel the ghost floating closer, practically hovering over her shoulder, trying to force Sophie to acknowledge her. Sophie just hummed a lo-fi hip-hop tune, untangling the copper wire of her lights with white-knuckled determination. Eleanor was not used to being ignored. For over a century, a mere drop in temperature was enough to send grown men weeping into the streets. Furious at this sheer audacity, the ghost decided to pull out the heavy artillery. The air grew heavy with the sharp, metallic scent of copper. Sophie heard a thick, wet slap against the wall in the living room, followed by the sound of something viscous dripping onto the floorboards. Sophie closed her eyes, took a deep, steadying breath of lavender-scented air, and walked into the living room. There, hovering proudly in the center of the room, was Eleanor. And behind her, on the faded mustard wallpaper, thick, crimson blood was oozing from the plaster itself. The blood spelled out 3 massive, blood-curdling words, the liquid trailing down in horrific, jagged streaks. Leave or die. It was a masterpiece of horror. It was undeniably terrifying. Sophie stared at the wall. Then, she stared at the floor, where the blood was threatening to stain the mahogany. Unbelievable, Sophie muttered, shaking her head in profound disappointment. She looked directly at the wall, skillfully letting her gaze unfocus, just enough, so she was staring through the glowing Victorian woman hovering in her line of sight. The landlord explicitly told me the plumbing had been updated. This is a massive moisture leak. Look at that rust water coming through the plaster. Disgusting. Eleanor's jaw dropped. Rust water. Without missing a beat, Sophie turned on her heel, marched to the pile of boxes near the door, and pulled out a drop cloth, a roll of blue painter's tape, and a metal paint tray. Finally, she produced a gallon can of high-quality, matte finish paint. The label read, Tranquil Sage. Sophie laid the drop cloth over the floorboards, carefully tucking it under the dripping letters. She popped the lid off the paint can, poured the thick, calming green liquid into the tray, and grabbed her roller. Eleanor watched in stunned, paralyzing silence as the mortal girl approached the wall. Sophie didn't hesitate. She rolled the thick green paint directly over the bloody L. Then the E. Honestly, the mustard yellow was giving me a migraine anyway, Sophie grumbled, rolling the paint over the A and the V. This is a blessing in disguise. A nice, soft green will really open up the space. Maybe I'll put a monstera plant in the corner. The ghost floated backward, her translucent hands clutching her skirts, her ethereal form flickering with pure, unadulterated shock. She watched as Sophie systematically, methodically painted over a century of sorrow, rage, and demonic manifestation with 2 coats of tranquil sage. When the wall was entirely green, Sophie stepped back, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead. She admired her work, completely ignoring the baffled phantom floating 3 feet away. Much better, Sophie declared softly to the empty room. She turned around, walked back to the kitchen, and finally poured hot water over her matcha powder. She wasn't leaving. She had a lease, she had her aesthetic, and frankly, she had dealt with worse roommates. The morning sun filtered through the massive bay window of apartment 4B, casting a warm, golden glow across the newly painted, tranquil sage walls. Sophie stretched in her bed, cocooned in a fluffy, pastel pink duvet, and took a deep breath. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old paper, with an icy, unnatural chill lingering near the foot of the bed. Hovering exactly 3 inches above the floorboards, Lady Eleanor waited. The Victorian phantom had been busy. After the deeply humiliating incident with the paint roller the previous evening, Eleanor had spent the witching hours orchestrating a masterpiece of supernatural imprisonment. She had summoned the latent energy of the building to fuse the front door's deadbolt. She had manifested a heavy, wrought iron bar across the door frame, a spectral lock that no mortal could bypass. Finally, she had taken Sophie's apartment keys, her student ID, and her debit card, and hidden them inside the hollow cavity of a gargoyle statue on the roof. Eleanor crossed her translucent arms, her morning gown drifting around her like underwater sea flora. She was ready. The mortal girl would wake up, realize she was trapped in a cursed, inescapable tomb with a vengeful spirit, and the glorious, frightening weeping would commence. Then, once the girl was thoroughly broken, Eleanor could comfort her, ensuring she never, ever tried to leave. Sophie threw off the covers. She slipped her feet into a pair of plush bunny slippers, completely oblivious to the fact that her left foot passed cleanly through the hem of Eleanor's spectral skirt, sending a jolt of icy static up her leg. Need to buy thicker socks, Sophie muttered, rubbing her calf. She padded into the bathroom, went through her 10-step skincare routine, and changed into a pair of comfortable, oversized beige sweatpants and a cropped white hoodie. Eleanor followed her like a gloomy, floating shadow, waiting for the panic to set in. Sophie grabbed her canvas tote bag, tossed her notebook inside, and walked to the front door. She reached for the brass handle, turned it, and pushed. The door didn't budge. Sophie frowned. She pushed harder, leaning her shoulder into the heavy oak. Nothing. It felt like it was welded shut. Eleanor drifted to the side of the doorway, a cruel, triumphant smirk playing on her pale lips. Yes, she thought. Feel the despair. You belong to the apartment now. Sophie sighed and reached toward the ceramic bowl on the entryway table where she always kept her keys. Her fingers scraped against empty porcelain. She blinked, rooting around the bowl, then checked the pockets of her tote bag. No keys. Eleanor leaned closer, practically hovering over Sophie's shoulder. Scream, the ghost urged silently. Scream and beg for release. Instead of screaming, Sophie pulled out her phone. She looked at the time, 8:15 a.m. Her first class, a grueling 3-hour lecture on advanced data structures, started at 9 a.m. She looked at the stuck door. She looked at the empty key bowl. Well, Sophie said aloud to the empty hallway, her voice entirely devoid of panic. The humidity must have warped the wood frame overnight. And I clearly left my keys in my other bag, which is probably at the bottom of a moving box. If I can't open the door, I can't go to class. It's simple physics. Eleanor's triumphant smirk vanished, replaced by a look of profound confusion. Physics. Honestly, the universe is giving me a sign, Sophie continued, turning her back on the impenetrable fortress of a door. I've been pushing myself too hard lately. What I really need is a mental health day. Yes. A dedicated self-care day. Thank you, warped vintage architecture. The Phantom watched in sheer disbelief as her captive, her terrified, helpless prisoner, cheerfully abandoned her escape attempt after less than 40 seconds of effort. Sophie practically skipped back to the kitchen. She fired up her pastel kettle, the water bubbling merrily as she began her daily matcha ritual. Eleanor, deeply offended by this lack of victimhood, decided to escalate. She dropped the temperature in the kitchen by 20 degrees, causing frost to bloom across the window panes. She rattled the cabinet doors so violently the hinges squeaked, and blew an icy gust of wind that knocked a stack of napkins off the counter. Sophie paused, whisk suspended in the bamboo bowl. The frost on the glass was thick enough to write on. The cold was biting. Wow, Sophie murmured. She reached up and pulled her hoodie strings tight, cinching the hood around her face until only her nose and eyes were visible. The cross breeze in this place is absolutely legendary. I love a good crisp morning. She grabbed her steaming mug of vibrant green tea, and walked to the living room, settling into the velvet armchair. Eleanor, seething with a mixture of rage and utter bewilderment, floated directly in front of Sophie, blocking the television. She glared at the mortal, her dark eyes flashing with spectral energy. Sophie simply leaned an inch to the left to look past the ghost. She pulled out a large, woven basket from beneath the side table. Inside were several skeins of bright pink wool. Sophie had a budget of $1,500 to launch her new small business, a line of handmade, custom-sized crochet halter tops and scrunches for students, and she wasn't about to let a little supernatural imprisonment cut into her production schedule. She pulled out a 4.5mm crochet hook and began to work. Her hands moved with practiced, rhythmic speed, looping and pulling the bright pink yarn into a complex pattern. Eleanor hovered, her ghostly form flickering. She had prepared for screaming. She had prepared for tears, for frantic clawing at the door, for the sweet, intoxicating power of a mortal begging for mercy. She had absolutely not prepared for a hostage situation that involved lo-fi hip-hop beats playing softly from a Bluetooth speaker, the scent of expensive green tea, and vigorous yarn crafts. For the next 3 hours, Sophie crocheted in total peace. Whenever Eleanor tried to manifest a frightening shadow on the wall, Sophie would use the darkened lighting as an excuse to turn on her cute, mushroom-shaped fairy lamps. Whenever Eleanor groaned with the voice of the damned, Sophie just tapped her foot to the beat of her music, assuming it was the pipes settling. Eventually, the ghost's energy began to wane. Haunting was exhausting work, especially when the target was completely oblivious. Eleanor floated down, her translucent skirts pooling on the floorboards, and sat cross-legged on the rug a few feet from Sophie's chair. She stared at the pink yarn moving fluidly through the girl's fingers. It was hypnotic. It was soft. It was the exact opposite of the cold, miserable eternity Eleanor had endured for over 100 years. Sophie finished a row, holding up the partially formed halter top to inspect the tension. Coming along perfectly, she whispered to herself. She took a sip of her now lukewarm matcha, her eyes drifting toward the translucent Victorian woman sitting on her floor. Sophie's gaze held for just a fraction of a second longer than it should have, a tiny smirk touching the corner of her mouth, before she willfully refocused her eyes on her yarn. I could break the windows, Eleanor thought miserably, resting her spectral chin in her hands. I could shatter every pane of glass in this wretched room. But as she watched Sophie meticulously count her stitches, surrounded by soft lighting and calming scents, the terrifying ghost of apartment 4B realized something horrifying. The girl wasn't trapped with her. Eleanor was trapped in a self-care day. And worst of all, she was actually starting to enjoy the music. Getting out of apartment 4B on Wednesday morning required a psychological standoff. Sophie had stood in front of the heavy oak door, her canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder, and spoken loudly to the empty hallway. Well, since the humidity has permanently warped the wood, I suppose I have no choice but to call emergency maintenance. They said they might have to bring the industrial chainsaw to cut through the historic 19th century frame. Such a shame to destroy original craftsmanship. The heavy wrought iron deadbolt had violently and instantaneously unlocked itself with a resounding clack. Oh, look at that, Sophie had said breezily, twisting the brass knob. The wood settled. Now, she was navigating the hushed, labyrinthine aisles of the university's oldest library, seeking refuge. The library was a towering monument to Gothic architecture, smelling heavily of deteriorating binding glue, vanilla-scented pages, and floor wax. It was the kind of place Sophie loved to study. Unfortunately, it was also exactly the kind of place Lady Eleanor felt completely at home. The Victorian ghost had decided that if she couldn't trap Sophie in the apartment, she would simply tether her spectral form to Sophie's shadow. Eleanor floated a mere 6 inches behind Sophie's left shoulder, her translucent morning gown drifting through the metal bookshelves, without disturbing a single volume. She was casting a localized aura of freezing temperature that made the hairs on Sophie's arms stand up, constantly whispering archaic, dramatic complaints about the vulgarity of modern youth and the scandalous hemlines of the passing students. Sophie ignored her with the practiced ease of someone who had survived group projects with incompetent peers. She adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and scanned the towering spines in the local history section. She was nominally here to work on a data structures assignment, but a morbid curiosity about why her apartment's rent was so cheap had led her to the municipal records aisle. She spotted a thick, leather-bound volume titled Architectural Anomalies and Tragedies of the Late 19th Century on the top shelf. It was exactly 3 inches out of her reach. Sophie stood on her tiptoes. Her fingers grazed the dusty top of the spine. She gave a small huff of frustration and prepared to jump. "Excuse me. Do you need a hand with that?" The voice was warm, rich, and unexpected. Sophie startled, dropping back onto her heels and turning around. Standing at the end of the aisle was a guy who radiated the exact opposite energy of Sophie's gloomy, haunted apartment. He had tousled, golden brown hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it all morning, a soft, oversized knit sweater that screamed cozy, and a bright, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his hazel eyes. A neat plastic name tag pinned to his sweater read, "Julian Archives Assistant." He was, objectively, the most adorable person Sophie had ever seen. He had the unmistakable aura of a golden retriever, who had magically been transformed into a human and given a library card. "Oh," Sophie said, suddenly intensely aware that she was wearing oversized sweatpants, and her hair was held up by a chaotic claw clip. Yes. Actually. The leather-bound one right up there. I think I'm officially too short for historical research." Julian let out a soft, booming laugh that echoed slightly in the quiet aisle. "It's a design flaw of the shelving, not a height flaw on your part. They built these racks for giants." He stepped closer, reaching up effortlessly to slide the heavy book from the top shelf. As he moved into Sophie's personal space, he brought with him the scent of cedarwood, old paper, and a hint of sweet pastry. Sophie felt a sudden, very UN academic flutter in her stomach. Lady Eleanor, however, felt pure, unadulterated rage. The ghost immediately materialized between Sophie and Julian, her translucent form hovering aggressively. Eleanor took one look at Julian's warm smile, his cozy sweater, and the blush spreading across Sophie's cheeks, and decided this mortal man was an absolute menace who needed to be destroyed immediately. Julian handed the heavy book down to Sophie. "Here you go. Architectural Anomalies. Light reading for a Wednesday morning." "You know how it is," Sophie smiled, taking the book. Her fingers briefly brushed his, and a jolt of static electricity snapped between them. "Oh," Julian chuckled, shaking his hand slightly. "Wow, the static in these old stacks is crazy today." "That wasn't static, you buffoon," Eleanor hissed, though only Sophie could hear the icy, echoing rasp of her voice. "Take one more step toward my companion, and I shall rend the flesh from your pathetic bones." Sophie's smile froze. She had to use every ounce of her willpower, every shred of her composure, to keep her eyes locked onto Julian's hazel eyes, completely ignoring the fact that a glowing Victorian phantom was currently hovering right next to Julian's ear. "Yeah," Sophie forced out a breathless laugh. "Crazy static. Must be the weather." Eleanor, furious that her telekinetic threat had been brushed off as a weather phenomenon, escalated her tactics. She floated directly behind Julian. As Julian continued to smile at Sophie, Eleanor lifted her spectral hands and began to pantomime violently gruesome acts behind his back. First, the ghost mimed tying a garrote wire around Julian's neck, pulling her ethereal hands tight, and sticking her tongue out in a dramatic display of strangulation. Sophie bit the inside of her cheek, so hard she tasted copper. "Do not look," she commanded herself. "Look at the cute librarian. Do not look at the ghost." "Are you looking into a specific building?" Julian asked, tilting his head. "I know the archives pretty well. If you're doing a paper on local history, I could probably pull some of the original blueprints for you. We have a whole section in the basement that isn't digitized yet." Sophie started, but lost her train of thought. Behind Julian, Eleanor had moved on from strangulation to a pantomime of a beheading. The ghost had manifested a glowing, ethereal executioner's axe, and was taking dramatic, slow-motion practice swings at the back of Julian's head. She paused, checked her ghostly grip, and then pantomimed an enormous, sweeping decapitation strike, catching her own invisible head as it supposedly fell. Sophie let out a sharp, choked noise that sounded like a cross between a cough and a dying seal. "Are you okay?" Julian asked, his brow furrowing with genuine concern. He took a step closer, totally oblivious to the phantom executioner swinging an axe through his torso. "I'm fine." Sophie wheezed, clapping a hand over her mouth and clearing her throat aggressively. "Just dust. The dust in this aisle. Very dusty. Asthmatic." "Oh, gosh, I'm sorry," Julian said, looking guilty. "We're supposed to dust the top shelves on Tuesdays, but I think someone slacked off. Do you need some water? The cafe downstairs makes a really great strawberry latte, if you want to get out of the dust for a minute." It was a thinly veiled excuse to extend the conversation, and under any normal circumstances, Sophie would have leaped at the opportunity. But Eleanor was now pretending to drink from a tiny, invisible teacup, before clutching her throat, pantomiming a gruesome death by poisoning, and pointing a rigid, accusatory finger directly at Julian's back. "A strawberry latte sounds amazing," Sophie managed to say, her voice strained as she actively fought the urge to break her aesthetic calm and yell at the ghost. But I actually have to get to a lecture. On data. Right. Of course, Julian smiled, though he looked a tiny bit disappointed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, library-branded notepad and a pen. He quickly scribbled something down and handed it to her. Well, if the data gets boring, or if you need help deciphering those old architectural records, let me know. I'm usually around here, or you can just text me. Sophie took the paper. Written in neat, looping handwriting was a phone number and the name Julian, the tall one from the archives. Thank you, Sophie said softly, finally managing a genuine, relaxed smile now that Eleanor had paused her pantomime to glare at the piece of paper in absolute disgust. I'm Sophie. It's really nice to meet you, Sophie, Julian said. He gave a little wave, turned around, and walked back down the aisle, his sneakers squeaking faintly on the floor wax. Sophie waited until he turned the corner and disappeared from sight. The moment he was gone, she let out a massive, exhausted exhale, leaning her forehead against the cool leather of the history book. Eleanor floated around to face her, crossing her arms over her chest. The ghost looked incredibly smug, clearly believing her frightening display of spectral violence had successfully driven the suitor away. Sophie slowly raised her head. She looked straight through Eleanor's chest, sighed deeply, and said to the empty air, "Goodness, the draft in here is giving me a headache. Time to go home." She slipped Julian's number safely into her tote bag, leaving a very confused and frustrated phantom in her wake. Preparing for a date in apartment 4B was an exercise in extreme psychological compartmentalization. Sophie had spent the better part of her Friday afternoon attempting to cultivate an atmosphere of effortless, lo-fi romance while actively pretending that a 19th century phantom wasn't hovering by the ceiling, violently criticizing her decor choices. Sophie smoothed out the wrinkles in her oversized beige cardigan and adjusted the aesthetic setup on her small, round dining table. She had laid out her textbooks, a fresh notebook, and a plate of aesthetically pleasing vanilla macarons. Her mushroom-shaped fairy lamps cast a warm, ambient glow across the room, specifically designed to counter the sickly, fluorescent lighting of the hallway outside. High above her, near the crown molding, Lady Eleanor drifted like a stormy, translucent thundercloud. The ghost had been in a foul mood ever since Wednesday. She had spent the last 48 hours manifesting strange, weeping noises from the plumbing and leaving frost patterns shaped like skulls on the bathroom mirror. Sophie, true to form, had simply bought a louder Bluetooth speaker and a bottle of heavy-duty glass cleaner. At 4 p.m., a soft, polite knock echoed through the apartment. Eleanor instantly plummeted from the ceiling, landing in the entryway with a frightening, ethereal thud. She threw her arms wide, attempting to physically block the heavy oak door. The temperature in the hallway plummeted, freezing the brass doorknob so intensely that a layer of white frost bloomed across the metal. Sophie casually walked over, grabbed a pastel pink dish towel to protect her hand from the freezing metal, and yanked the door open, pulling it right through Eleanor's glowing, outraged torso. Julian stood in the hallway, looking like the human embodiment of a cozy autumn afternoon. He was wearing a slightly oversized flannel shirt over a white tee, and in his hands, he held a cardboard tray carrying 2 large, iced strawberry lattes and a small pink bakery box. "Hey," Julian smiled, his hazel eyes crinkling. "I hope you don't mind, I brought reinforcements. The cafe downstairs just pulled a fresh batch of strawberry tarts, and I figured data structures required high-level sugar intake." "You are an absolute lifesaver," Sophie breathed, genuinely touched. She stepped back to let him in. "Please, come on in. Ignore the chill, the draft in the hallway is ridiculous today." "No kidding," Julian chuckled, stepping over the threshold. He shivered slightly as he passed directly through Eleanor's localized aura of freezing despair. "Wow, you weren't kidding about the insulation. It feels like stepping into a walk-in freezer." "I am not a draft, you uncultured, library-dwelling peasant," Eleanor hissed, her voice echoing like grinding stones in a deep cavern. "I am the chilling breath of the grave." Sophie seamlessly ignored the disembodied voice. She led Julian to the dining table, taking the lattes and the bakery box. Make yourself comfortable. I was just setting up my notes. Julian set his backpack down and looked around the apartment, his eyes widening with genuine appreciation. Sophie, this place is incredible. I know you said it was cheap, but the architecture alone, look at these ceilings. And you've decorated it so nicely. It feels so soft and peaceful in here. Eleanor, deeply offended by the word peaceful, immediately caused the massive, ornate cast iron chandelier hanging above them to swing violently back and forth. The heavy glass prisms clattered together with a frantic, alarming noise. Julian looked up, his brow furrowing. Whoa! Is there a subway line that runs under this building? That is some intense structural vibration. Just old pipes settling, Sophie lied smoothly, pulling out a chair and sitting down. She took a sip of her strawberry latte, refusing to look up at the swinging metal death trap above her head. It happens all the time. You get used to it. Julian nodded, accepting her explanation with absolute, baffling ease. He pulled out his own chair, sat across from her, and unpacked his laptop. For the next hour, they actually managed to study. Or, at least, Julian studied. Sophie spent most of the hour sneaking glances at the way the warm light caught the golden brown highlights in his hair, and the gentle, focused way he chewed on the end of his pen when he was reading. It was nice. It was normal. It was the kind of sweet, mundane college experience Sophie had been desperately craving. Which meant, of course, that Eleanor could not allow it to continue. The ghost had been pacing the perimeter of the dining room, her anger compounding with every shared smile, every accidental brush of their knees under the table, and every soft laugh Julian let out. Eleanor's possessive nature was flaring into an absolute inferno. Sophie belonged to the apartment. Sophie belonged to her. This soft-spoken boy with his absurdly sweet lattes was an intruder, a threat to her eternity. Eleanor stopped pacing. She floated directly to the center of the table, hovering right over the plate of macarons. She glared at Julian, her dark eyes entirely completely black, bleeding into the whites. Leave, Eleanor commanded, her voice dropping into a subsonic frequency that vibrated the very air. Leave her be. Julian didn't hear the voice, but he did rub his temples, suddenly looking slightly uncomfortable. Man, the air pressure in this building is really something. My ears just popped. Eleanor's spectral face twisted into a mask of pure fury. If he would not leave out of fear, she would physically drive him out. The ghost raised both of her pale, translucent hands, her fingers curling into tight claws. She locked her telekinetic gaze onto the two beautiful, heavy ceramic mugs Sophie had set out earlier for water. With a sharp, violent thrust of her ghostly hands, Eleanor unleashed a wave of poltergeist energy. Crash! Both ceramic mugs exploded simultaneously. They didn't just fall over, they shattered outward with explosive force, sending shards of thick, pastel pink ceramic flying across the mahogany floorboards in a frightening shower of shrapnel. Julian jumped entirely out of his seat, letting out a startled yelp. He instinctively reached across the table, grabbing Sophie's arm to pull her back away from the blast zone. Whoa! Sophie, are you okay? What just happened? Sophie hadn't flinched. She was staring at the empty space on the table where her favorite mugs used to be. Slowly, a deep, profound irritation began to bubble up in her chest, entirely overriding her fear. Those mugs had cost her $3,000 each. I'm fine, Sophie said, her voice chillingly calm. Did they just explode? Julian asked, staring at the debris on the floor in utter bewilderment. Was there a microfracture in the ceramic? Or maybe the temperature differential from the draft caused a sudden thermal shock. Thermal shock. Yes. Exactly, Sophie said flatly. She stood up, her jaw set tight. She walked over to the entryway closet and retrieved a long-handled broom and a dustpan. Eleanor hovered by the table, crossing her arms triumphantly. She looked incredibly smug, waiting for Julian to finally realize this was a cursed, dangerous environment and flee into the night. Instead, Sophie marched back into the dining room with the broom. She got down on her knees, taking the dustpan, and began to sweep up the ceramic shards. She moved methodically, sweeping the pieces together. Eleanor drifted down, planting her ethereal, translucent feet directly in the middle of the debris field. She lifted her chin, daring Sophie to acknowledge her presence. She wanted Sophie to realize the sheer, destructive power she commanded. Sophie looked up. She looked past Eleanor, locking eyes with Julian, who was hovering nervously, apologizing for not helping her sweep. "Don't worry about it, Julian," Sophie said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "It's just a little mess. Nothing a good, thorough sweeping can't handle." Without breaking eye contact with Julian, Sophie took the bristled end of the broom and forcefully, aggressively swept it straight forward. The stiff plastic bristles passed directly, deliberately through Lady Eleanor's translucent, ghostly shins. The ghost gasped, a silent, outraged sound of pure shock. The feeling of the physical object passing through her ectoplasm felt like a burst of static electricity. Sophie didn't stop. She swept the broom back, then forward again, passing the dirty bristles right through the phantom's knees, completely ignoring the ghost's horrified expression. Sweep. 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 It was the ultimate, unspoken disrespect. She was treating a terrifying, centuries-old poltergeist like a pile of dust bunnies. Eleanor practically flew backward, her mouth hanging open in sheer, indignant disbelief. She retreated to the safety of the ceiling, clutching her spectral skirts, utterly scandalized. "There," Sophie said cheerfully, dumping the shards into the dustpan and standing back up. "All clean. Now, where were we on those binary search trees?" By Sunday afternoon, Lady Eleanor's supernatural patience had completely evaporated. The ghost had spent the last 48 hours brooding near the ceiling, her ethereal form flickering with dark, stormy energy. She had tried freezing the water pipes, short-circuiting the router, and manifesting the faint, weeping sounds of a Victorian widow from the air vents. Sophie had countered by buying bottled water, using her phone's hotspot, and turning up her lo-fi hip-hop playlist to drown out the weeping. But what truly pushed Eleanor over the edge was the fact that Julian had returned. He hadn't just returned, he had arrived wielding a cordless power drill, a little plastic box of heavy-duty drywall anchors, and a dazzling, golden retriever smile. Sophie had texted him the day before, mentioning that she had found a massive, ornate, Gothic-style mirror at a local flea market, but was terrified of destroying the apartment's ancient plaster if she tried to hang it herself. Julian, predictably, had immediately volunteered his handyman services. Now, he was standing in the center of Sophie's meticulously curated living room, wearing a fitted grey t-shirt that showed off his shoulders in a way that was entirely distracting to Sophie, and entirely offensive to Eleanor. "All right," Julian said, tapping the wall with his knuckles and listening to the hollow thud. "The studs in this place are spaced really weirdly, probably because of the 19th century framework. But if we use these toggle bolts, this mirror isn't going anywhere." "You're a lifesaver," Sophie said, leaning against the doorframe of the kitchen. She had deliberately chosen to wear a pair of pastel pink corduroy overalls and a white crop top for this exact interaction. It was a calculated, effortless-looking outfit, and based on the way Julian kept glancing over at her, it was working perfectly. "I was terrified it was going to fall and crush me in my sleep." "Not on my watch," Julian grinned, turning the drill on with a short, authoritative whir. Hovering upside down from the ceiling like a frightening, glowing bat, Eleanor glared at the mortal boy. She looked at the mirror leaning against the wall. It was a beautiful piece, heavy cast iron forged into twisting, dark vines, framing a thick pane of silver-backed glass. It was the sort of mirror Eleanor had admired in her youth. The idea that this sun-kissed, library-dwelling peasant was about to permanently affix it to her wall was a profound insult. "I will crush him," Eleanor promised silently, her dark eyes narrowing. "I will flatten him into a pancake, and then I will possess the pancake." Julian measured the distance, marked the wall with a pencil, and expertly drilled the pilot holes. He tapped the heavy-duty anchors into place, his biceps flexing slightly with the effort. Sophie took a sip of her iced green tea, thoroughly enjoying the view, stubbornly ignoring the fact that the ambient temperature in the room had suddenly dropped to near freezing. "Okay, moment of truth," Julian said, dusting off his hands. He walked over to the heavy iron mirror. With a grunt of effort, he hoisted the 50-pound monstrosity off the floor, carried it over to the wall, and carefully slotted the thick iron wire over the heavy bolts. He adjusted it slightly, ensuring it was perfectly level. He stepped back, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "There. Solid as a rock. You could probably hang off that thing." Eleanor, suspended directly above him, unleashed a silent, terrifying shriek of absolute defiance. She channeled every ounce of her poltergeist fury, drawing upon the residual energy of the cursed apartment. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and burning dust. The overhead fairy lights violently flickered, and a layer of frost instantly bloomed across the freshly hung glass. Eleanor duffed toward the mirror, plunging her glowing, translucent hands directly into the iron frame. With a violent, telekinetic upward heave, she tore the heavy wire entirely off the mounting bolts. The 50-pound iron mirror plummeted straight down, directly toward Julian's head. Sophie gasped, dropping her glass of iced tea. It shattered on the floorboards, splashing green liquid everywhere. But Julian, possessing reflexes completely utterly unsuited for a quiet archivist, didn't panic. Hearing the scrape of metal, he simply took a half step back, reached out with both hands, and caught the heavy iron frame mid-air before it could hit the floor. The sheer weight of it made him grunt, his boots skidding slightly on the floor wax, but he held it firm. He hefted the massive mirror back up, resting it easily against his thigh, and looked at the wall in mild surprise. "Whoa," Julian chuckled, completely unfazed by his brush with death. He inspected the heavy mounting wire on the back of the mirror. "Wow, these 19th century pieces do not mess around with their weight distribution." The wire completely snapped. It must have been corroded. "Good thing I caught it, huh? That would have ruined your beautiful floorboards." Eleanor froze. She floated 3 feet away, her jaw slack, staring at the mortal who had just caught a lethal, supernaturally propelled iron projectile, and blamed it on corroded wire. Sophie pressed a hand to her chest, trying to slow her racing heart. "Are you okay? It didn't hit you." "I'm perfectly fine," Julian smiled warmly, setting the mirror safely back down on the floor. "Honestly, the craftsmanship on this iron is incredible. They just don't make them like this anymore. I'll run to the hardware store down the street and grab some industrial steel cable. Be right back." He gave Sophie a bright, reassuring smile, grabbed his keys, and jogged out the front door, leaving Sophie alone in the living room. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut, the apartment plunged into absolute chaos. Eleanor lost her ghostly mind. The phantom materialized fully, her form expanding until she seemed to fill the entire room. Her Victorian morning gown billowed with unseen, spectral winds. The temperature plummeted so fast that Sophie's breath plumed in white clouds. The fairy lights didn't just flicker, they violently popped, one by one, showering sparks onto the floor. Eleanor flew directly at Sophie, stopping mere inches from her face. The ghost's visage was no longer elegant, it was twisted into a frightening mask of fury, her eyes pitch black, her jaw unhinging slightly in a classic, horrific display of spectral rage. "Why does he not perish?" Eleanor screamed, her voice vibrating through the floorboards, rattling Sophie's teeth in her skull. "I dropped 50 pounds of iron upon his skull. Why does he smile? I will rend his flesh. I will burn this mortal shell to ash. You are mine. Mine." The ghost was so close that Sophie could see the swirling, icy mist inside her translucent form. Eleanor waved her arms frantically, throwing a whirlwind of cold air around the room, sending Sophie's carefully organized notebooks flying off the table in a tornado of paper. Sophie stood perfectly still. For 4 weeks, she had maintained the facade. For 4 weeks, she had looked through the ghost, ignored the bleeding walls, painted over the terror, and swept the broom through her legs. She had promised herself, she would not let a haunting ruin her peace. But as a loose sheet of notebook paper smacked directly into her face, and the terrifying, shrieking ghost of a Victorian bride hovered 2 inches from her nose, ruining her perfectly curated romantic afternoon. Something inside Sophie finally snapped. She slowly reached up and peeled the piece of paper off her face. She took a deep breath. And then, Sophie looked directly into Lady Eleanor's pitch-black, frightening eyes, locking her gaze for the very first time. "Can you please chill out?" Sophie screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I am trying to flirt. I like him. He is cute, he brings me pastries, and he knows how to use a power drill. So help me, if you try to drop one more piece of antique furniture on his perfectly styled hair, I am going to buy a sage bundle, light it on fire, and shove it up your ectoplasmic nose. Back off." Silence crashed over the apartment. The localized tornado of paper instantly ceased. The icy winds died. Lady Eleanor's jaw snapped shut. Her pitch-black eyes slowly faded back to their normal, ghostly brown. The phantom floated backward, clutching her chest in absolute, unadulterated shock. She stared at Sophie, her translucent form trembling. "You?" Eleanor whispered, her voice barely a scrape of wind. "You can see me." Before Sophie could answer, the front door swung open. Julian stepped inside, holding a spool of heavy-duty steel wire. He stopped in the entryway, blinking in surprise. The room was a disaster area. Papers were scattered everywhere, the fairy lights were blown out, a glass of iced tea was shattered on the floor, and Sophie was standing in the center of the room, breathing heavily, aggressively glaring at an empty patch of air near the ceiling. Sophie froze. Her face flushed a deep, mortified crimson. She slowly turned her head to look at Julian, terrified that she had just ruined everything. She had just been caught screaming at thin air like a complete lunatic. Julian looked at the messy room, then looked at Sophie's flushed, frustrated face. A slow, incredibly fond smile spread across his features. "You know," Julian said softly, walking over and gently picking up one of her fallen notebooks. "My older sister used to yell at the furniture when she was stressed out, too. Especially when DIY projects went wrong. She used to scream at the IKEA instructions." Sophie blinked, utterly stunned. You think I was yelling at the mirror?" "Well, it did almost crush me," Julian laughed, setting the notebook on the table. He walked over to her, his hazel eyes warm and completely devoid of judgment. "It's totally understandable. Honestly, Sophie. It's actually really cute. I like that you have a little fire in you." Sophie stared at him, completely speechless. He thought her psychotic, ghost-directed breakdown was cute. Over Julian's shoulder, Lady Eleanor floated closer. The ghost was still staring at Sophie with wide, shocked eyes, completely ignoring the librarian. Eleanor raised a trembling, glowing hand, pointing a single, accusatory finger directly at Sophie's face. "You lied to me," the ghost whispered, sounding genuinely, deeply offended. "For a month. You utterly deceitful, magnificent little liar." For the next 20 minutes, the atmosphere in apartment 4B was so thick with unspoken tension that it could have been cut with a butter knife. Julian, blissfully unaware of the supernatural Cold War happening 3 feet above his head, hummed a cheerful indie folk song as he threaded the industrial steel cable through the back of the heavy iron mirror. He twisted the metal securely, double-checked the weight distribution, and effortlessly hoisted the antique piece back onto the wall. "Perfect," Julian announced, wiping his hands on his jeans. He flashed Sophie that bright, golden retriever smile. "That's not coming down unless the entire building collapses. Which, given the warped door frames, isn't totally impossible, but at least the mirror will survive." Sophie offered a weak, incredibly strained smile. "Thank you, Julian. Really. I appreciate it." She was currently sitting rigidly on the edge of the velvet armchair, her hands tightly clutched in her lap. Directly behind Julian, Lady Eleanor was hovering at eye level. The ghost was no longer screaming or throwing poltergeist tantrums. Instead, Eleanor was staring intensely at Sophie, her translucent head tilted, her ghostly eyes narrowed into icy, calculating slits. It was the deeply unsettling gaze of someone who had just realized they had been completely, utterly played. Julian packed his drill and the empty toggle bolt box into his bag. He slung it over his shoulder and walked over to Sophie. "I should probably let you get back to your studying," Julian said softly. He reached out, gently tucking a stray curl behind Sophie's ear. His fingers were warm, and the brief contact sent a very pleasant shiver down her spine. "Try not to yell at any more inanimate objects today, okay? But if the aesthetic gets too overwhelming, you have my number." Sophie swallowed hard, her heart doing a completely involuntary flip. "I will. Thank you for the lattes. And for saving my life from the corroded wire." Julian chuckled, leaned in, and pressed a soft, fleeting kiss to her cheek. "See you later, Sophie." He turned and headed out the front door, the heavy lock clicking shut behind him with a final, decisive thud. The instant the latch engaged, the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Sophie slowly stood up from the armchair. She didn't bother pretending to look at her notebook. She didn't pretend to check her phone. She simply crossed her arms, squared her shoulders, and looked directly up at the hovering Victorian phantom. "Well," Sophie said flatly, "I suppose the ectoplasmic cat is out of the bag." Eleanor descended slowly, her morning gown billowing around her until her translucent boots touched the mahogany floorboards. She floated closer, her face a mask of profound, aristocratic outrage. "You saw me," Eleanor hissed, her voice echoing with the chilling rasp of the grave. "From the very first night. You looked upon my frightening visage, you witnessed the blood weeping from the walls, and you painted over it with tranquil sage." The mustard yellow was genuinely giving me a migraine, Sophie defended defensively, holding her ground. "And for the record, tranquil sage is a premium matte finish. I paid out of pocket for that." Eleanor threw her glowing hands into the air, utterly exasperated. "I sealed the doors. I froze the windows. I manifested the disembodied weeping of 100 damned souls. I bought a louder Bluetooth speaker," Sophie countered, refusing to back down. "You swept a broom through my shins." Eleanor shrieked, the sheer indignity of the memory causing her ethereal form to flicker violently. "A filthy, modern, plastic broom. I am a creature of eternal sorrow. I am the terror of the 4th floor. How dare you treat me like a common dust bunny? How dare I?" Sophie yelled back, her own frustration finally boiling over. "Do you have any idea what the housing market is like in this city right now? I am a graduate student. I am surviving on instant ramen, iced coffee, and sheer spite. I found a 2-bedroom apartment, with original crown molding and a bay window for $600,000 a year. Do you know how impossible that is?" Eleanor blinked, slightly taken aback by the mortal's ferocity. "What does your financial destitution have to do with your blatant disregard for my hauntings?" "Everything." Sophie threw her hands up, gesturing to the meticulously curated, pastel-draped room. "If I acknowledge you, if I admit that my cheap, beautiful apartment is inhabited by a violent, territorial ghost, then I have to leave. I have to break my lease, lose my security deposit, and move back into a cramped dorm with 3 girls who don't know how to wash a frying pan. I am too broke to deal with a haunting, Eleanor." The ghost's eyes widened. She stared at Sophie, absorbing the bizarre, aggressively modern logic. "So," Eleanor whispered, floating an inch closer. "You were not devoid of fear. You were simply ignoring me out of stubbornness." "I was terrified for the first 3 days," Sophie admitted, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "When you made the chandelier swing, I thought I was going to throw up. But then I realized that if you actually wanted me dead, you would have just dropped it on me right away. Instead, you just acted like an incredibly toxic, passive-aggressive roommate. And honestly, I've dealt with worse." Eleanor fell silent. She looked at the mortal girl standing before her. For over a century, every single person who had crossed the threshold of this apartment had fled screaming into the night. They had abandoned her. They had treated her like a monster. But this girl, this chaotic, exhausted, fiercely stubborn girl had been terrified, yet she had chosen to stay. She had painted the walls, unpacked her tea, and simply refused to be chased away. A strange, entirely unfamiliar feeling began to bloom in Eleanor's cold, spectral chest. It was a profound, begrudging respect. "You are an utterly deranged creature," Eleanor stated, her voice losing its chilling, echoing resonance and dropping into a haughty, aristocratic drawl. "Thank you." "Now," Sophie said, taking a step forward and pointing a stern finger at the ghost. "We need ground rules. I am not leaving. But you cannot keep trying to murder Julian. He is incredibly sweet, he smells like cedarwood, and I really, really want to kiss him without a heavy iron object crushing his skull." Eleanor's face immediately contorted in disgust. The librarian. The sun-kissed peasant who catches 50-pound mirrors and blames it on corrosion. He is an idiot. He is optimistic, Sophie corrected sharply. And he is off limits. No dropping things on him. No freezing his tea. No pantomiming beheadings behind his back. Deal? Eleanor crossed her arms, her translucent skirts swishing petulantly. She looked away, her jaw tight. She desperately wanted Sophie to herself, but the sheer thrill of finally having someone to actually talk to, someone who wasn't screaming or running away, was too intoxicating to risk losing. "Fine," Eleanor muttered, sounding like a petulant Victorian teenager. "I shall refrain from causing him bodily harm. But I reserve the right to judge his hideous modern footwear." Sophie let out a long, exhausted breath, a genuine smile finally breaking across her face. "I can live with that." Life in apartment 4B changed drastically once the veil of supernatural ignorance was lifted. Instead of enduring cold spots, bleeding walls, and poltergeist tantrums in stubborn silence, Sophie now had to deal with something far more exhausting, a clingy, highly opinionated, 19th-century roommate who literally never slept. Since their explosive confrontation, Lady Eleanor had ceased trying to terrify Sophie. Instead, she had opted for constant, inescapable companionship. The ghost hovered next to Sophie while she brushed her teeth, aggressively critiquing her use of chemical pastes. She floated over the kitchen counter while Sophie crocheted, offering unhelpful advice on color theory based entirely on 1890s morning fashion. But the true test of their new truce came on Tuesday evening. Julian was coming over for dinner. He had insisted on bringing takeout from the incredible Thai place near the library to celebrate Sophie passing her data structures midterm. "You cannot allow him to dine in this establishment," Eleanor declared. She was draped dramatically across the velvet armchair, her translucent form glowing faintly in the dim lighting of the mushroom lamps. "He is a peasant. He probably eats with his hands. He is bringing pad thai, Eleanor." "We use chopsticks," Sophie said, arranging 2 sets of pastel pink ceramic plates on the dining table. "And remember our agreement. No dropping things. No freezing his food. No attempting to stop his heart with spectral terror." "I agreed to no bodily harm," Eleanor sniffed, adjusting her ghostly skirts. "I made no promises regarding my verbal assessments of his character." A polite knock at the door interrupted them. Sophie hurried over and pulled the heavy oak open. Julian stood in the hallway, holding a brown paper bag that smelled delightfully like roasted peanuts and chili. He flashed his signature bright smile, but Sophie's eyes immediately dropped to his outfit. He was wearing a pair of light wash, deliberately distressed jeans with massive rips at the knees, paired with an oversized, faded band t-shirt. It was a perfectly normal, attractive, casual outfit for a college student in the 21st century. Behind Sophie, the temperature in the entryway plummeted by 10 degrees. "Good heavens above," Eleanor gasped, her ghostly voice echoing with sheer, unadulterated scandal. "He has been mauled by a wild beast. Look at his pantaloons. They are shredded. The boy is utterly destitute." Sophie bit the inside of her cheek to stop a laugh. "Hey, Julian. Come on in." Julian stepped inside, shivering slightly as he passed through Eleanor's localized aura of aristocratic horror. "Hey. I brought the spring rolls, too. Extra peanut sauce. Does he have no pride?" Eleanor floated aggressively around Julian, inspecting his ripped knees as he walked to the table. If he cannot afford intact trousers, he should not be courting. I shall fetch my sewing kit, though I fear my ethereal needles cannot pierce such cheap, vulgar denim. They sat down at the table. Julian unpacked the cartons, completely oblivious to the Victorian phantom hovering right next to his ear, staring at his exposed kneecap with profound, tragic disgust. Sophie portioned out the noodles, struggling to keep a straight face. The juxtaposition of Julian's warm, golden retriever energy and Eleanor's icy, aristocratic fury was breaking her brain. She couldn't hold it in anymore. "So, Julian," Sophie started, taking a sip of her ice water. "My internal monologue has some very strong opinions about your outfit tonight." Julian paused, a forkful of noodles halfway to his mouth. He blinked, looking down at his shirt. "Oh? Is the band tee too casual? I can go change if we're doing a fancy plating situation." No, it's not the shirt," Sophie said, leaning her chin on her hand. She glanced up at Eleanor. "My imaginary Victorian roommate is absolutely horrified by your pants. She thinks you've been mauled by a bear and is deeply concerned about your financial inability to purchase intact pantaloons." Julian stared at her for a second. Then, a loud, delighted laugh burst out of him. "Your imaginary Victorian roommate?" "Yes. Her name is Lady Eleanor," Sophie said with a completely straight face, while the actual Lady Eleanor gasped in outrage at being called imaginary. "She is currently floating near your left shoulder and offering to sew your jeans back together, so you don't shame my household." Julian chuckled, leaning into the bit entirely. He turned his head slightly to his left, looking directly through the translucent, sputtering ghost. "Well, please tell Lady Eleanor that I appreciate her concern, but the distressed denim is a stylistic choice. It provides optimal ventilation for the knees." Eleanor's spectral jaw dropped. Ventilation. For the knees. The scandal. The pure, unbridled vulgarity of it. "He is a harlot." "She says you're a harlot," Sophie translated effortlessly, picking up a spring roll. Julian threw his head back and laughed again, the sound warm and echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "A harlot? Wow, Lady Eleanor pulls no punches. I like her. She keeps me humble." "He likes me." Eleanor paused mid-rant. The ghost blinked, entirely thrown off by the compliment. She slowly lowered her translucent hands, drifting down to sit elegantly on the empty chair beside Julian. She smoothed her ghostly skirts, looking at the librarian with a slightly less murderous glare. "Well. At least the peasant takes criticism well. Tell him my aesthetic eye remains unmatched." Sophie smiled, shaking her head. "She says her aesthetic eye is unmatched. I'd expect nothing less from a 19th century noblewoman," Julian grinned, finally taking a bite of his noodles. "Tell her I'll wear my Sunday best next time." The rest of the evening passed with surprising, hilarious ease. Sophie no longer had to stifle her reactions to Eleanor's dramatic floating or her icy complaints. Instead, she seamlessly integrated the ghost into their conversation, passing Eleanor's sharp, haughty commentary off as her own eccentric sense of humor. Julian, thinking Sophie was just brilliantly, playfully weird, engaged with the bit enthusiastically. For Sophie, it was the most fun she had experienced in months. She was eating good food, sitting across from a boy she really liked, and secretly brokering peace with an undead entity. As they cleaned up the plates, Julian stood close to Sophie by the sink. The warm scent of cedarwood wrapped around her. "I had a really great time tonight, Sophie. And Lady Eleanor," he added, throwing a wink toward the empty space next to the fridge. Eleanor, hovering by the ceiling, actually offered a stiff, formal nod. "He is acceptable. For a mortal." Julian leaned in, his hazel eyes locking onto Sophie's. The distance between them vanished. He softly pressed his lips against hers, a sweet, lingering kiss that made Sophie's heart race. Sophie closed her eyes, melting into the kiss. For 5 perfect seconds, the haunting, the rent, and the stress disappeared entirely. "He is breathing far too heavily upon you." Eleanor's voice echoed, shattering the moment as the temperature dropped instantly. "Step away, harlot. Unhand her." Sophie pulled back, laughing softly against Julian's lips. The truce, it seemed, had strict limits. Enjoying the story? Subscribe to Horcom After Dark for more late-night mysteries and horrors. Saturday morning in apartment 4B was supposed to be dedicated entirely to yarn math and structural engineering. Sophie had cleared off her dining table to make room for her inventory. With her $15,000 budget meticulously tracked in a pastel spreadsheet on her laptop, she was organizing vibrant skeins of yay wool by color gradient. Her crochet brand was finally taking off. She had 3 orders for custom halter tops and 5 for oversized scrunches, but she desperately needed more storage. Enter Julian, the golden retriever librarian, who had once again arrived armed with tools. Today's mission was installing heavy-duty floating shelves in the awkward, recessed alcove next to the towering stone fireplace. "I still say we should just stack the yarn in the corner," Julian grunted. He was currently standing on a step stool, tapping the heavy stones of the fireplace surround with the handle of a screwdriver. "I don't trust this masonry. It looks like it was mortared with sheer willpower and Victorian dust. You are questioning the structural integrity of 19th century stonework." Lady Eleanor scoffed. She was hovering near the ceiling, her translucent arms crossed in deep offense. "That fireplace has withstood a century of winters, you insolent peasant. Your plastic floating shelves will crumble long before my hearth gives way." "Eleanor says your lack of faith in Victorian masonry is deeply offensive," Sophie translated without looking up from her yarn, meticulously logging a bright yellow skein into her inventory. "She thinks the shelves are going to crumble." Julian laughed, wiping a smudge of soot from his cheek. He had completely leaned into the Lady Eleanor bit over the past week, often bringing a second, tiny pastry from the cafe specifically for the ghost. "Tell her I appreciate the craftsmanship," Julian smiled, tapping another stone. "But this specific block sounds entirely hollow. Listen." He tapped a large, rectangular stone roughly at eye level. Instead of the dull, solid thud of the other rocks, this one produced a sharp, echoing clack. Sophie paused her typing. She looked up, her curiosity piqued. "Wait. Do it again." Julian tapped it again. It definitely sounded hollow. He set the screwdriver down and gripped the edges of the stone with his fingertips, wiggling it slightly. To both of their surprise, the mortar around it was completely dry-rotted. With a horrific grating sound that set Sophie's teeth on edge, Julian pulled the heavy stone straight out of the wall. A cloud of dark, century-old dust plumed into the air, instantly overpowering the scent of Sophie's lavender diffuser. "Whoa," Julian coughed, waving his hand in front of his face. He peered into the dark, rectangular cavity left behind by the stone. "Sophie, you've got a hidden compartment in your wall. This is like something out of one of my archival mysteries." Sophie abandoned her yarn, rushing over to the step stool. "Are you serious? Is there anything inside?" Julian reached his hand into the pitch-black alcove. He rummaged around for a moment before his fingers closed around something solid. "Yeah. It feels like the box." Slowly, carefully, he pulled the object out into the light. It was a small, heavy wooden lockbox, bound in rusted iron strips. The wood was nearly black with age, coated in a thick, greasy layer of soot. It looked undeniably ancient, and undeniably out of place in Sophie's pastel-curated sanctuary. "Put it on the coffee table," Sophie breathed, her eyes wide with excitement. "This is amazing. Do you think it's treasure? Old coins? Maybe the deed to the building?" Julian carried the heavy box to the living room, setting it down gently on the glass coffee table. Sophie grabbed a spare dish towel, carefully wiping away the thickest layer of grime. The iron lock on the front was completely rusted through. It had essentially disintegrated into orange flakes. Above them, the ambient temperature of the room began to drop. It wasn't the usual, petulant chill that Eleanor used to signify her annoyance. This was a sudden, bone-deep, marrow-freezing cold that made Sophie's breath instantly visible in the air. Sophie looked up. Eleanor had floated down from the ceiling, but the ghost wasn't smirking, and she wasn't haughty. Eleanor's translucent form was violently flickering, almost glitching out of existence. Her ghostly eyes were wide with a terror so profound it made Sophie's own heart physically ache. "No," Eleanor whispered. The sound wasn't in the room, it echoed directly inside Sophie's skull, a sound of agonizing, raw panic. "Do not open it. Sophie, I beg of you. Leave it be." "Eleanor," Sophie said softly, her excitement vanishing, replaced by a sudden, heavy dread. "What is it?" Julian looked up from the box, furrowing his brow. "Is the bit getting too spooky? We don't have to open it if you don't want to." "No, Sophie hesitated. She looked at the ghost, who was now clutching her ethereal head, her face twisted in absolute anguish. But the mystery was right there, sitting on her coffee table. Before Sophie could stop herself, she reached out and flipped the rusted latch. The lid creaked open with a sound like a dying gasp. Inside the box, resting on a bed of decaying, moth-eaten velvet, were two items. The first was a stack of letters, tied together with a faded, brittle black ribbon. The paper was yellowed and crisp, the elegant, looping handwriting on the top envelope barely legible. The second item was a heavy, ornate silver locket. It was remarkably untarnished compared to the box, gleaming with an oily, unnatural light. Its surface was engraved with a strange, twisting insignia that looked less like a monogram and more like a warning. "Wow," Julian whispered, leaning in. "These have to be from the late 1800s. Look at the wax seals on those letters. And that locket, that's a heavy piece of silver." "Do not touch it," Eleanor shrieked. It was the loudest, most horrifying sound the ghost had ever made, a banshee wail that shattered one of the mushroom fairy lamps on the side table. Julian jumped, startled by the exploding bulb. "Okay, wow, that thermal shock is getting aggressive." Sophie ignored the broken lamp. She was drawn to the locket. It felt like it had a gravitational pull, a heavy, hypnotic weight that demanded to be held. Slowly, almost involuntarily, she reached her fingers into the box. "Sophie, don't," Eleanor sobbed, falling to her ghostly knees on the floorboards. Sophie's fingertips brushed the cold silver of the locket. The instant her skin made contact, the atmosphere in apartment 4B completely, violently shattered. The comforting scent of lavender and yew was instantly annihilated, replaced by the suffocating, putrid stench of rotting flowers and copper blood. The tranquil sage paint on the walls seemed to darken, the edges of the room bleeding into pitch-black shadows that stretched and warped unnaturally. Julian stumbled backward, gasping for air. "Sophie. Sophie, what's happening? The air pressure, it's suffocating." This wasn't a draft. This wasn't a structural vibration. A low, resonant, masculine laugh echoed from the walls themselves, a sound dripping with malice and centuries of festering cruelty. The shadows in the corner of the room began to coalesce, twisting upward, forming a towering, distinctly malevolent silhouette that blotted out the light from the bay window. Eleanor cowered on the floor, her glowing form dimming to a faint, terrified flicker. The locket in Sophie's hand grew scorching hot. She gasped, dropping it back into the wooden box, but it was too late. The residual, dark energy of the man who had betrayed Lady Eleanor had been awakened, and he was absolutely furious to find strangers in his domain. The laugh that echoed through apartment 4B did not belong to Lady Eleanor. It was a thick, baritone sound, heavy with malice, scraping against the walls like iron dragging across stone. The towering silhouette in the corner of the living room began to coalesce, drawing the ambient shadows into itself until it formed the distinct, imposing figure of a man. He wore a long, 19th-century overcoat and a top hat, but he had no face, only a swirling vortex of pitch-black smoke and two piercing, ember-red eyes. The stench of rotting flowers and metallic copper grew so intense that Sophie gagged, pressing her hands over her mouth. "Sophie, we need to leave. Now," Julian coughed, his golden retriever optimism completely evaporating. He grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the coffee table. I don't know what this is. A gas leak. A severe carbon monoxide hallucination. We have to get into the hallway. He dragged her toward the entryway, but as they spun around, Sophie let out a choked gasp. The heavy oak front door was gone. It hadn't just locked. It had vanished completely, seamlessly replaced by a solid expanse of the sickly, peeling mustard yellow wallpaper Eleanor had always despised. Julian slammed his hands against the wall where the door should have been, his knuckles hitting solid, unyielding plaster. What the hell? Julian shouted, his voice cracking with genuine panic. He spun back toward the living room, putting himself squarely between Sophie and the towering shadow. Okay, this is a highly localized, synchronized hallucination. We are experiencing severe oxygen deprivation. Julian, it's not a hallucination. Sophie yelled, her hands trembling as she backed up against him. The shadow entity took a step forward. With every inch it moved, the floorboards rotted beneath its feet, turning black and spongy. It ignored Sophie and Julian entirely, its burning red eyes locking onto the corner of the room where Lady Eleanor was cowering. The usually haughty, terrifying poltergeist was curled into a tight ball on the floor. Her translucent form was flickering so violently she was barely visible, her hands clamped over her ears, as if trying to block out a sound only she could hear. Still weeping, Eleanor, the shadow entity hissed. The voice didn't travel through the air, it vibrated directly into the marrow of their bones. A century in the dark, and you are still a pathetic, sniveling burden. Eleanor. Sophie cried out, taking a step toward her ghost. The entity's head snapped toward Sophie. Its red eyes flared, locking onto the silver locket still resting in the wooden box on the table. Thieves, it snarled, the temperature in the room spiking from freezing to a suffocating, unbearable heat. Filthy modern rats. Touching what is mine. The shadow lunged. It moved with unnatural, frightening speed, stretching across the room like a striking viper. A massive hand made of solid, freezing darkness reached out, aiming directly for Sophie's throat. Hey! Julian roared. Without a second thought, the librarian grabbed the heavy, wooden step stool he had used to inspect the fireplace and swung it like a baseball bat directly at the shadow's head. The wood passed through the smoke, but the sheer force of the shadow's momentum hit Julian like a freight train. The entity casually backhanded the air. An invisible, concussive wave of force threw Julian off his feet, sending him crashing violently into the dining table. The table splintered, collapsing under his weight in a shower of pink ceramics and ruined pad thai. Julian! Sophie screamed. She grabbed the nearest object, her heavy, brass-handled fabric scissors, and brandished them in front of her. It was a pathetic defense against a century-old demon, but she refused to die in her own apartment without a fight. Back off. This is my lease. The entity laughed again, a cruel, mocking sound. It raised its hand, the dark smoke solidifying into razor-sharp, obsidian claws, ready to cleave Sophie in two. Sophie squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact. But the strike never came. A blinding, icy blue light exploded in the center of the room. The sheer intensity of the glow forced the shadow entity to recoil, throwing its arms up to shield its red eyes. Sophie opened her eyes. Standing directly in front of her, acting as a physical shield, was Lady Eleanor. But she wasn't the faint, translucent, flickering ghost she usually was. Eleanor was glowing with the brilliance of a dying star. She had materialized fully into the mortal realm, drawing on every ounce of residual energy in the apartment. Her morning gown swept the floor, solid and real. Her dark hair whipped around her face in an ethereal wind, and her eyes burned with a terrifying, unearthly blue fire. Eleanor thrust both of her hands forward. A massive wall of solid, crackling ice erupted from the floorboards, slamming into the shadow entity, and pushing it backward with the force of a glacier. Do not touch her. Eleanor roared, her voice shattering the remaining glass in the kitchen cabinets. It was the voice of an apex predator defending its territory. From the wreckage of the dining table, Julian groaned. He pushed the broken wood off his chest, a cut on his forehead bleeding sluggishly. He blinked, his vision swimming, and looked up at the center of the room. He saw the towering shadow demon. He saw Sophie, clutching her scissors. And then, he saw the glowing, frighteningly real Victorian woman standing between them, conjuring literal ice magic from her fingertips. Julian's jaw dropped. All the color drained from his face as his strictly logical, librarian-wired brain completely short-circuited. "Oh my God," Julian whispered, clutching his bruised ribs. The bit wasn't a bit. "Lady Eleanor is real." Eleanor didn't look back, but she let out a sharp, aristocratic scoff that echoed over the roaring magical winds. "Of course I am real, you insufferable peasant. Now get up. The structural integrity of this room is about to be severely compromised." Julian scrambled to his feet, staring at Sophie in absolute, horrified awe. "You've been having tea with an actual, literal ghost. I told you I was too broke to move." Sophie yelled over the chaos, grabbing Julian's hand. "Now help me find a way to kill her ex-fiancé." The wall of solid ice cracked with a sound like a cannon shot, sending a spiderweb of glowing blue fractures across its surface. On the other side, the shadow entity pounded against the barrier, its fists made of condensed, freezing darkness. Julian was hyperventilating, though he was trying to do it in a very polite, restrained sort of way. His strictly logical, catalog-driven brain was desperately trying to process the fact that he was standing in a sealed room with a demonic shadow monster, and his crushed imaginary Victorian roommate was currently holding it off with high-level criminality. "Okay," Julian gasped, pressing a hand to his bruised ribs. "Okay. Let me just update my mental database. Lady Eleanor is a literal, 19th century poltergeist. She is not a coping mechanism for a drafty apartment. And that towering column of murderous smoke is her evil ex-fiancé. Do keep up, Julian." Sophie yelled over the screech of tearing ice. She sprinted toward the coffee table, dodging a flying shard of frozen plaster. She grabbed the heavy wooden lockbox containing the letters and the silver locket, slamming the lid shut and tucking it securely under her arm. "Are you going to have a breakdown, or are you going to help me?" "I am multitasking," Julian yelled back. "I cannot hold him indefinitely," Eleanor shrieked. The intense, blinding light radiating from her ethereal form was beginning to dim, flickering back toward her usual translucent state. Manifesting physically was draining her century-old reserves at an alarming rate. "The dark anchor has empowered him. You must flee this accursed chamber." "We can't." Sophie pointed frantically at the blank expanse of mustard yellow wallpaper where the front door used to be. "He sealed us in." Julian stared at the wallpaper, his eyes darting back and forth as his archival training suddenly overrode his mortal terror. "Wait. He's an aristocratic ghost from the 1890s, right?" "He is a parasitic scoundrel," Eleanor clarified, gritting her ghostly teeth as another massive crack split her ice wall. "But he operates on Victorian logic," Julian insisted, his hazel eyes widening with sudden realization. "Sophie, I digitized the original architectural blueprints for this building last semester. In 1892, this wasn't an apartment building, it was a single manor house. He sealed the main entrance because, to a nobleman, that is the only entrance. But there was a servant's wing." Sophie stared at him. "A what?" "A servant's entrance." Julian grabbed Sophie's hand, his grip warm and grounding amidst the freezing chaos. "The kitchen. There has to be a secondary egress point that his aristocratic ghost brain didn't think to seal." Sophie's head snapped toward the kitchen. Specifically, she looked directly at the immaculate, tranquil sage-painted wall right behind her beloved, meticulously curated matcha station. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," Sophie breathed in absolute despair. Crash! The ice wall shattered entirely. A hurricane of freezing wind and razor-sharp ice shards exploded into the living room. The shadow entity roared, a sound that vibrated the fillings in Sophie's teeth, and surged forward, its red eyes locked onto the wooden box under her arm. "Run!" Eleanor screamed. The ghost abandoned her solid form, reverting to a shimmering, translucent wisp of blue light, and shot past the shadow, distracting it by flying directly through its face. The entity recoiled, swiping blindly at the phantom. Julian didn't hesitate. Pulling Sophie by the hand, they sprinted into the kitchen. "Where is it?" Sophie yelled, sliding on the floorboards. "It should be right here." Julian pointed directly at the wall behind the bamboo whisk and the pink ceramic kettle. He didn't wait for permission. Julian grabbed Sophie's heavy cast iron skillet from the stove, raised it over his head, and swung it like a sledgehammer directly into the beautifully painted drywall. Sophie let out a tragic, heartbroken wail as the cast iron smashed through the plaster, utterly destroying the aesthetic integrity of her kitchen. A shower of white dust and chunks of tranquil sage rained down, revealing the dark, rotting wood of a hidden door underneath. Julian swung again, smashing the rusted latch off the ancient wood. He kicked the door hard with his boot, and it burst open with a groan of decaying hinges, revealing a narrow, pitch-black spiral staircase leading downward. "Go, go, go." Julian ushered Sophie forward. Sophie threw herself into the dark, dusty stairwell, clutching the lockbox to her chest. Behind them, the shadow entity blasted through the kitchen threshold, tearing the doorframe to splinters. It reached a massive, smoky hand toward Julian's collar. Suddenly, Lady Eleanor materialized right beside Julian. She looked completely exhausted, her form so transparent she was almost invisible, but she still possessed enough poltergeist fury to grab Julian by the collar of his flannel shirt and violently yank him backward into the stairwell. "Arg!" Julian yelped as he tumbled backward into the dark. Eleanor slammed the heavy wooden servant's door shut, driving her ethereal hands into the wood and freezing the ancient lock solid with a final burst of icy magic. A second later, a massive, concussive force hit the other side of the door. The wood bowed inward, the hinges screaming, but Eleanor's ice held. The terrifying, muffled roar of the shadow entity echoed from the kitchen, but it could not break through. The stairwell was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness, smelling heavily of mildew and century-old dust. Sophie leaned against the curved stone wall, sliding down to sit on the narrow steps. She was gasping for air, her heart threatening to beat its way out of her ribcage. Next to her, she heard Julian groaning as he sat up, his flashlight clicking on a second later. The beam illuminated the cramped, cobweb-filled space. Floating a few feet above them, looking significantly less intimidating without her ice powers, was Lady Eleanor. The ghost looked down at Julian, her ethereal chest heaving. Julian pointed the flashlight slightly away from the ghost's face out of politeness. He wiped the plaster dust off his forehead, gave a breathless, slightly hysterical laugh, and looked up at the Victorian phantom. "Well," Julian panted, offering a weak smile. "It is officially very nice to meet you, Lady Eleanor. Thank you for not letting me die." Eleanor floated down, crossing her arms. She looked at his dust-covered, distressed jeans, sniffed haughtily, and said, "Your trousers are still an absolute disgrace, librarian. But your architectural knowledge is mildly acceptable." The pitch-black servants' stairwell deposited the trio into the flooded, rat-infested basement of the building. From there, Julian's surprisingly robust knowledge of municipal utility tunnels guided them through a rusted storm grate and out into the blinding, humid afternoon sun. For Lady Eleanor, leaving the cursed boundaries of apartment 4B for the first time in 130 years, was a deeply traumatic experience, made significantly worse by the fact that they had to escape in Julian's 2012 Honda Civic. "This carriage is a vibrating death trap." Eleanor shrieked from the backseat, clutching the fabric of the headrest. Her translucent form was flickering wildly in the sunlight, tethered only by her proximity to Sophie. "It smells of artificial pine and stale fried potatoes. I demand you halt this infernal machine." "It's called a drive-through, Eleanor, and I vacuumed last week." Julian defended, gripping the steering wheel as he sped toward the university library. "Just hang on. The entity is bound to the apartment's foundation, so as long as we keep moving, we're out of his reach." Sophie sat in the passenger seat, clutching the soot-stained wooden lockbox tightly against her chest. Her heart was still hammering against her ribs, her mind reeling from the fact that her cozy, pastel-curated life had suddenly turned into an intense, supernatural survival mission. 10 minutes later, Julian used his master archivist keys to smuggle them through the library's loading dock and into the secure, windowless rare books room in the basement. It was a climate-controlled sanctuary of silence, smelling comfortingly of old paper and dust. Sophie set the lockbox down on a large steel table. Eleanor immediately floated over, keeping a safe distance from the heavy silver locket resting inside. The ghost's ethereal glow illuminated the dark room, casting eerie blue shadows against the towering shelves of municipal records. "All right," Julian breathed, pulling his laptop from his backpack and booting it up. He cracked his knuckles, the golden retriever optimism returning now that he was in his natural habitat. "Let's figure out who we're dealing with." Sophie read the letters carefully. Sophie tentatively reached into the box, bypassing the cursed locket to slide out the stack of brittle, yellowed envelopes. The wax seal crumbled as she opened the first one. She smoothed the paper flat, squinting at the elegant, looping 19th century cursive. "It's from a Lord Reginald," Sophie read aloud, her voice tight. She looked up at Eleanor, whose spectral face instantly twisted with deep, recognizable pain. "He wrote this the day he left you. My dearest Eleanor. By the time you read this, I shall be halfway across the Atlantic with your father's fortune. The locket I leave behind is bound with my eternal triumph. You shall rot in that manor, a monument to my success." Sophie stopped, disgusted. What a complete and utter sociopath. "He was a monster," Eleanor whispered, her ethereal form drooping, the trauma of a century of isolation weighing her down. "He possessed dark, occult leanings. That locket is an anchor, forged from his boundless arrogance and cruelty. It tethered his spirit to the apartment, so he could gloat over my misery even in death. He lived a life of unimaginable luxury with my family's wealth, while I froze to death in the dark." Julian's fingers flew across his keyboard. The blue light of the screen reflected in his hazel eyes. "Okay. Lord Reginald. 1892. If he stole a massive fortune and lived a life of luxury, his name will be all over the elite social registers and property deeds of the era. Let's track this aristocratic scumbag down." For a few tense minutes, the only sound in the room was the frantic clacking of keys and the hum of the library's ventilation system. Sophie gently organized the letters, realizing that Reginald had systematically drained Eleanor's accounts before trapping her. He hadn't just broken her heart, he had engineered her demise out of pure, malicious greed. "Wait," Julian muttered, leaning closer to the screen. He clicked a few more times, pulling up a digitized microfilm scan of a newspaper from 1893. "That can't be right. What did you find?" Sophie asked, stepping around the table to look over his shoulder. "I searched the global aristocratic registries for the decade following 1892. Reginald's name completely disappears. He didn't buy a mansion. He didn't establish a shipping company." Julian quickly toggled to another database, his eyes scanning a spreadsheet of municipal death certificates. "I broadened the search to general census records, and I found him." Julian turned the laptop around so Sophie and Eleanor could see. "Lord Reginald didn't live a life of luxury," Julian announced, a triumphant, disbelieving smirk spreading across his face. "According to these police records, 3 weeks after he fled with your family's fortune, he was swindled by a con artist in a back alley gambling den. He lost absolutely every penny." Eleanor floated closer, her ghostly eyes widening in sheer shock. He lost the fortune." "It gets better," Julian said, tapping the screen. "Because he was utterly broke, he couldn't afford passage on a luxury liner. He tried to stow away on a cargo ship transporting livestock. He contracted severe, untreatable dysentery, and died completely penniless in a public quarantine ward 6 weeks after he left you." Sophie stared at the screen. She looked at Julian, then looked up at the frightening, aristocratic phantom hovering above the table. "Dysentery," Sophie said, fighting the sudden, hysterical urge to laugh. "He died of extreme diarrhea on a boat full of cows." Eleanor was utterly silent. For 130 years, she had believed her betrayer was a mastermind of cruelty, a dark, triumphant god who had conquered her and won the world. The dark shadow entity in the apartment derived its entire terrifying power from Reginald's overwhelming pride and Eleanor's deep-seated belief in his victory. But it was a lie. A pathetic, humiliating lie. He did not perish in a duel of honor. Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with something entirely new. He soiled himself to death. Oregon Trail style, Julian confirmed, nodding gravely. He was a pathetic, gullible loser who died in his own filth. A sudden, sharp sound echoed in the rare books room. It took Sophie a second to realize what it was. Lady Eleanor was laughing. It wasn't a ghostly wail, or a terrifying shriek. It was a bright, bell-like, profoundly joyous laugh that echoed through the archives, clearing the heavy, cold air instantly. The ghost threw her head back, her translucent form glowing with a warm, brilliant light. A cowship? Eleanor gasped between peals of ghostly laughter. The great Lord Reginald, felled by tainted livestock and weak bowels. Sophie grinned, looking at Julian. The golden retriever librarian looked incredibly pleased with himself. Sophie, Julian said, his voice turning serious as he looked at the wooden box. That shadow entity in your apartment is a manifestation of Reginald's pride. But he has no pride left. The locket is an anchor built on a complete delusion. Sophie looked at the heavy silver locket. The oppressive, terrifying aura it had radiated just an hour ago suddenly felt incredibly fragile. If we go back, Sophie said, her eyes narrowing with determination. If we go back and tell him the truth, we can shatter his ego. And if we shatter his ego, Eleanor said, floating down beside them, her eyes blazing with a fierce, vindicated light, I will personally shatter his anchor. We are going back to the apartment. It is time to take out the trash. The drive back to the apartment was charged with an electric, manic energy. The revelation of Lord Reginald's pathetic, bovine-adjacent demise had completely transformed Lady Eleanor. The Victorian phantom was practically vibrating in the backseat of Julian's Honda Civic, occasionally letting out a sharp, vindictive giggle that frosted the rear windows. But as they reached the fourth floor of Sophie's building, that triumphant mood violently evaporated. The hallway outside apartment 4B was unrecognizable. The flickering, sickly fluorescent lights had shattered, replaced by the dim, sputtering glow of antique gas lamps. The mustard yellow wallpaper was peeling back in wet, heavy strips, oozing a thick, black sludge that smelled of ozone and rotting wood. Okay, Julian whispered, clicking on his heavy-duty flashlight. The beam cut through the freezing, misty air. The entity's area of effect has expanded. It's bleeding into the common areas. He knows we left, Eleanor hissed, her ethereal glow dimming slightly as they approached the heavy oak door. He is fortifying the anchor. The apartment is no longer a mortal dwelling. He has pulled it fully into the spectral plane. Sophie clutched the soot-stained wooden lockbox tightly against her chest. Inside, the silver locket pulsed with a terrifying, rhythmic heat, like a second, mechanical heartbeat. I don't care what plane it's in. I paid my rent for the month, and I am not letting a diarrheal Victorian con artist keep my security deposit. Julian stepped in front of her, raising his booted foot. With a grunt of effort, he kicked the heavy oak door squarely next to the lock. The rotted wood splintered instantly, the door flying inward with a heavy crash. They stepped over the threshold, and Sophie let out a devastated gasp. Apartment 4B was gone. The tranquil sage walls, the plush pastel throw pillows, the meticulously organized yarn baskets, all of it had been completely consumed. The entity had warped the physical space into a nightmarish, decaying recreation of the 1890s manor where Eleanor had been betrayed. The ceilings stretched upward into unnatural, shadowy heights. The floorboards were blackened and spongy, covered in a threadbare, moldering Persian rug. The massive bay window no longer looked out over a canopy of elm trees, instead, it revealed a churning, blood-red sky swirling with dark, stormy vortexes. Where Sophie's beautiful matcha station had once been, a massive, rotting mahogany desk now stood, covered in dead, blackened roses. My fairy lamps, Sophie whispered, genuinely heartbroken. He completely destroyed the aesthetic. Welcome to your tomb. The voice did not come from a single direction, it vibrated out of the rotting woodwork, shaking the dust from the massive, rusted chandelier hanging above them. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched and snapped together, forming the towering, faceless silhouette of Lord Reginald. The entity had grown since they last saw it. It was now a terrifying, 10-foot-tall monolith of freezing darkness, its ember-red eyes burning with absolute malice. "You dare return," the shadow entity roared, the sheer force of its voice sending a shockwave of cold air that nearly knocked Julian off his feet. "You bring the weeping bride and a lockbox of stolen memories. You are nothing but insects in my domain." Eleanor floated forward, her eyes blazing with blue fire. "You are no lord of this domain, Reginald. You are a pathetic, sniveling cheat." She raised her glowing hands, attempting to summon the massive wall of ice that had protected them before. But as the blue magic sparked at her fingertips, the shadow entity laughed, the deep, grating sound that seemed to suck the very oxygen out of the room. "This is my house, Eleanor," the entity bellowed. "Built on your tears. Fueled by your century of terror. You have no power here." The room suddenly tilted. The walls warped inward, projecting horrific, ghostly echoes of the past. Sophie saw spectral visions of Eleanor falling to her knees in this exact room, weeping as the door locked her inside. The environment itself was saturated with 130 years of Eleanor's ingrained trauma. The sheer, suffocating weight of her own history slammed into the ghost. Eleanor gasped, her glowing blue magic sputtering and dying out. She fell to the rotting floorboards, her translucent hands clutching her head as the frightening echoes of her past betrayal overwhelmed her newfound confidence. "Eleanor!" Sophie screamed, running forward, but an invisible wall of force threw her back. Julian caught Sophie before she hit the ground, his arms wrapping securely around her waist. "Sophie, the environment is draining her. The entity is feeding on her residual fear to maintain this illusion. She will weep for eternity," the shadow entity sneered, gliding closer, its obsidian claws extending from the smoke. "And you too will rot beside her." The entity raised a massive arm, and the rusted iron chandelier above them tore free from the ceiling, hurtling straight down toward Sophie and Julian like a spiked meteor. "Move!" Julian tackled Sophie to the side. The chandelier smashed into the floorboards right where they had been standing, sending up a geyser of black dust and splinters. Sophie scrambled to her feet, coughing through the dust, her grip on the wooden lockbox like a vice. She looked at Eleanor, who was flickering wildly, paralyzed by the nightmarish illusions of the room. She looked at the towering demon of smoke and pride. "Julian!" Sophie yelled over the roaring, spectral winds, flipping the rusted latch of the wooden box. "Distract him. I need to get the locket directly to Eleanor. Distract the 10-foot smoke demon." Julian yelled back, his eyes wide. He looked around the decaying room, his gaze landing on the rotting mahogany desk and the heavy, brass-bound inkwell resting on top of it. The librarian gritted his teeth, a reckless, determined light flashing in his hazel eyes. "You got it. Just run." Julian sprinted across the rotting Persian rug, his sneakers slipping on the spongy, blackened wood. He dove behind the massive mahogany desk, just as the shadow entity unleashed a horizontal wave of freezing black smoke that decapitated a nearby marble bus. "Hey! Over here, you overgrown smog cloud!" Julian yelled, popping up from behind the desk. He grabbed the heavy, brass-bound inkwell, wound up his arm like a baseball pitcher, and hurled it directly at the entity's face. The brass inkwell sailed through the air and struck the entity squarely between its glowing red eyes. It didn't do any physical damage, but the antique black ink exploded outward, splattering across the entity's smoky visage like a humiliating, cartoonish pie to the face. The entity stopped dead. It slowly wiped a massive, shadowy hand across its face, the red eyes flaring with absolute, murderous outrage. "You dare strike me with my own stationery," the entity bellowed, the sound vibrating the decayed floorboards. It abandoned Sophie entirely, turning its towering, frightening form toward the librarian. "I shall flay the flesh from your bones and feed you to." "Feed me to the cows." Julian interrupted, his voice echoing loudly in the warped, nightmarish room. He grabbed a rotting wooden chair, holding it out in front of him like a lion tamer facing down a beast. Is that what you were going to say, Reggie? Because I read the municipal records. I know exactly what happened to you. The entity paused, its smoky form wavering slightly at the casual use of the nickname Reggie. Taking advantage of the distraction, Sophie scrambled across the room, crawling over the shattered remains of the crystal chandelier. The gravity near Eleanor felt crushing, saturated with a century of despair. The air was so thick with phantom sorrow that Sophie could hardly breathe, but she refused to stop. She clutched the wooden lockbox tightly, finally sliding on her knees until she reached the cowering, flickering ghost. Eleanor. Sophie gasped, dropping the box and reaching out to grip the phantom's ethereal shoulders. Her hands passed through the icy ectoplasm, but she kept them there, grounding the spirit with her presence. Eleanor, look at me. Snap out of it. He won, Eleanor sobbed, her voice a fragile, broken whisper. Her eyes were squeezed shut, trapped in the hallucination of her past. He took everything. He left me in the dark. I am nothing but a monument to his triumph. He didn't triumph over anything. Julian's voice rang out across the room, completely shattering the gothic horror ambience. The librarian was actively backpedaling now, dodging massive swipes of obsidian claws as he shouted at the top of his lungs. You didn't build an empire, Reginald. You took a fortune to the gambling dens, and got completely scammed in 3 weeks. You were the easiest mark in the city. The entity froze, its massive claws hovering mid-air. Lies, it shrieked, though the baritone rumble of its voice suddenly sounded panicked, almost shrill. I was a god among men. You died of dysentery. Julian yelled, leaping over a collapsed bookshelf. You tried to stow away on a cargo ship full of livestock, because you couldn't afford a ticket. You died broke, sick, and covered in cow manure. You are literally the biggest loser of the 19th century. The effect was instantaneous. The towering, 10-foot monolith of freezing darkness shuddered violently. The entity was born of Reginald's supreme arrogance and Eleanor's belief in his victory. Confronted with the pathetic, humiliating truth, the very foundation of its existence began to crumble. The oppressive, suffocating weight of the room instantly lightened. The rotting illusions of the 1890s manor began to flicker, revealing patches of Sophie's tranquil sage-painted walls underneath. Sophie shook Eleanor's shoulders. Do you hear him? He didn't win, Eleanor. He died in a pile of fertilizer. He's a pathetic, cowardly fraud, and his anchor is built on a complete delusion. Eleanor's ghostly eyes snapped open. The paralyzing terror that had gripped her for 130 years vanished, replaced entirely by a surge of pure, unadulterated Victorian rage. The ghost stopped flickering. She stood up, her translucent form solidifying and expanding until she was glowing with an intense, blindingly bright blue light. The icy winds returned, but this time, they weren't swirling in panic, they were sharp, focused, and deadly. A cowship? Eleanor hissed, her voice echoing with dangerous, electric power. She turned her burning gaze toward the wavering, shrinking shadow entity. You left me to rot, you stole my family's legacy, and you squandered it in a gambling den, before dying in a puddle of your own filth. Eleanor, wait, the entity stammered, its red eyes shrinking in terror as it backed away from the furious phantom. Sophie. The locket. Julian yelled, diving behind the remains of the velvet armchair as a stray blast of dark energy shot past his head. Sophie ripped the lid off the wooden box. The heavy silver locket was burning with a frantic, pulsing heat, vibrating violently as the entity's power destabilized. Sophie reached into her pocket and pulled out her heavy, brass-handled fabric scissors, the very same ones she had used to try and defend herself earlier. Eleanor. Let's take out the trash. Sophie yelled, placing the cursed locket squarely on the solid oak floorboards. Eleanor floated down beside her. The Victorian ghost looked at the mortal girl who had refused to run away, who had painted over the blood, shared her tea, and was now actively fighting a demon for her peace of mind. A fierce, beautiful smile crossed Eleanor's face. She placed her glowing, translucent hand directly over Sophie's hand gripping the scissors. Together, Eleanor whispered. Channeling every ounce of her century-old poltergeist magic into the brass blades, Eleanor guided Sophie's hand. The scissors glowed with a blinding, crackling blue fire. With a loud, triumphant battle cry, Sophie drove the heavy brass point directly into the center of the silver locket. Crack! The sound was deafening, like a lightning strike inside the living room. The thick silver casing shattered into a dozen jagged pieces. The shadow entity let out an agonizing, ear-splitting scream. The massive pillar of black smoke violently imploded, folding in on itself as the dark magic tethering it to the mortal realm was severed. With a final, pathetic wail that sounded suspiciously like a man with severe intestinal distress, Lord Reginald's spirit was blasted into absolute nothingness. A shockwave of pure, warm light exploded outward, rushing through the entire apartment. The nightmarish illusions of the rotting 1890s manor shattered like glass. The suffocating smell of ozone and decay was instantly swept away by the comforting, familiar scent of lavender and matcha. Sophie collapsed onto the floorboards, gasping for air, her grip on the brass scissors finally loosening. Silence descended on apartment 4B. Julian slowly peeked his head out from behind the overturned velvet armchair. His hair was completely disheveled, his face was covered in a thick layer of soot, and his flannel shirt was torn at the shoulder. He looked around the room, blinking in the warm glow of the remaining, unbroken fairy lights. Well, Julian coughed, a tired but victorious grin spreading across his face. I think it's safe to say my library card officially doubles as a demon hunting license. The quiet that settled over apartment 4B was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was the soft, ringing silence that follows a sudden, massive release of pressure, like a breathless exhale after a century of holding it in. The horrific, rotting floorboards had reverted back to their scuffed, familiar mahogany. The towering, shadow-drenched ceilings had lowered back to their standard 12 feet. The walls were once again painted in Sophie's beloved tranquil sage, though they were currently dusted with a thick, powdery layer of pulverized drywall from the massive hole Julian had smashed in the kitchen. Sophie sat back on her heels, her chest heaving as she stared at the shattered pieces of the silver locket scattered across the floor. The heavy brass fabric scissors lay beside them, the metal still warm to the touch from the explosive release of spectral energy. A few feet away, Julian let out a long, exhausted groan. He rolled over from his position behind the overturned velvet armchair, and simply lay flat on his back on the floor, staring up at the cracked plaster of the ceiling. His usually pristine, cozy librarian aesthetic was entirely ruined. His face was streaked with black soot, his flannel shirt was torn at the shoulder, and his hair was standing up in every direction, stiff with 19th century dust. I am going to need to take a shower, Julian announced to the ceiling, his voice raspy. A very, very long shower. Possibly with industrial-grade soap. And maybe a tetanus shot, just to be safe. That antique desk looked heavily rusted. Sophie let out a weak, breathless laugh. She crawled over to him, her own pastel pink overall stained with dark ash, and collapsed onto the floor right next to him. You realize the university library is going to feel incredibly boring after today, right? I certainly hope so, Julian sighed, turning his head to look at her. Despite the dirt and the exhaustion, his hazel eyes were warm and bright. He reached out, gently lacing his fingers through hers. I prefer my historical research to involve less running for my life and more reading. Sophie squeezed his hand, a profound wave of affection washing over her. He hadn't run. When faced with a literal, towering demon of smoke and malice, Julian hadn't abandoned her. He had yelled insults at it, thrown antique stationery, and fought alongside her. Thank you, Sophie whispered softly. Anytime, Julian smiled, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. A soft, ethereal throat-clearing sound interrupted the quiet moment. Sophie and Julian both sat up, wincing as their bruised muscles protested. They looked toward the center of the living room. Lady Eleanor was sitting gracefully on the floorboards, her heavy morning gown arranged perfectly around her. But something was fundamentally different about the ghost. The icy blue light that usually radiated from her translucent form was entirely gone. The freezing aura that always accompanied her, the chilling dread that froze brass doorknobs and shattered ceramic mugs, had vanished. Instead, Eleanor was glowing with a soft, warm, golden light. It looked like the ambient glow of a peaceful sunset filtering through a dusty window pane. Sophie scrambled to her knees, immediately concerned. "Eleanor. Are you okay? You're not fading, are you?" The Victorian phantom looked down at her own hands. She turned them over, flexing her translucent fingers, watching the golden light ripple beneath her spectral skin. She looked up at Sophie, her dark eyes wide with a quiet, profound sense of wonder. "I am not cold," Eleanor whispered. For 130 years, she had been defined by the freezing, agonizing chill of her betrayal. She had lashed out, terrorizing anyone who dared enter her domain, desperate to make them feel the same paralyzing isolation that Reginald had forced upon her. She had been trapped in an endless, looping nightmare of a winter night in 1892. But looking at the shattered pieces of the silver locket, the nightmare was finally over. The anchor of Reginald's pride had been destroyed, and with it, the heavy, suffocating chain of Eleanor's trauma. Eleanor floated upward, drifting closer to Sophie and Julian. She didn't hover near the ceiling like a menacing gargoyle. She stayed at their eye level, her golden glow casting a comforting warmth over the ruined living room. "You fought for me," Eleanor said, her voice stripped of its usual haughty, echoing resonance. It was just a voice now, the voice of a woman who had finally found peace. She looked at Sophie, her expression incredibly soft. "I terrorized you. I locked you inside. I shattered your belongings. Yet, when the shadow came for me, you did not run. You stayed." "Of course I stayed," Sophie said fiercely, ignoring the ache in her ribs. "You're my roommate, Eleanor. We have an agreement. And frankly, nobody gets to be that condescending to you except me." A tiny, genuine smile touched Eleanor's lips. She turned her gaze to Julian, who was still sitting on the floor, looking up at her with wide, reverent eyes. "And you, librarian," Eleanor said, her tone taking on a slight, familiar edge of aristocratic judgment, though the underlying warmth betrayed her true feelings. "You are an utter fool. Throwing a brass inkwell at a demonic entity is the tactical equivalent of throwing a pebble at a cannon." "Hey, it distracted him, didn't it?" Julian defended, rubbing the back of his neck sheepishly. "And I got to call a 19th century Lord Reggie. That's basically the highlight of my archival career." Eleanor let out a soft, melodic chuckle. She drifted closer to Julian, studying his face. "You possess no noble titles. Your wealth is non-existent. Your pantaloons are still a tragic crime against tailoring." She paused, her golden eyes softening as she looked at the way Julian instinctively shifted slightly, keeping his body positioned protectively between the ghost and Sophie. "But," Eleanor continued softly, "you possess a steadfast heart. You protected her when I could not. You possess the loyalty that Lord Reginald lacked. You are acceptable." It was the highest praise Lady Eleanor had ever given a mortal being. Julian's face broke into a wide, genuine grin. "Thank you, Lady Eleanor. I promise to buy pants without holes in them for our next dinner party." "See that you do," Eleanor sniffed delicately. "I will not have a peasant ruining the aesthetic of our dining table." Sophie let out a long, happy sigh, leaning her head against Julian's shoulder. The apartment was a complete disaster zone. Her matcha station was covered in drywall dust, her pink fairy lamps were shattered, and the front door was currently hanging by a single, groaning hinge. The cleanup was going to be an absolute nightmare, and she was likely going to have to forfeit a portion of her security deposit to fix the wall in the kitchen. But as the warm, golden light of her Victorian roommate filled the room, and the scent of cedarwood and old paper from the librarian beside her grounded her, Sophie couldn't bring herself to care. For the first time since she signed the lease, apartment 4B didn't feel like a cursed, silly bargain. It felt, undeniably and wonderfully, like home. Eleanor drifted toward the bay window, looking out at the late afternoon sun filtering through the elm trees. The frantic, possessive need to keep Sophie trapped inside had completely vanished. She didn't want to hold Sophie hostage anymore. She just wanted to watch her be happy. The golden light radiating from Lady Eleanor did not fade. If anything, it grew brighter, suffusing the ruined living room of apartment 4B with the gentle, amber hue of a perfect autumn afternoon. For over a century, Eleanor had only known the bitter, freezing cold of the grave. She had been tethered to the physical world by a heavy chain of trauma, resentment, and a profound fear of abandonment. But now, with Lord Reginald's dark anchor utterly obliterated into silver shards on the floorboards, that chain was completely gone. Eleanor floated toward the large bay window. She reached out, her translucent fingers gently pressing against the glass. For the first time since 1892, she did not feel the oppressive, magnetic pull of the apartment's foundation keeping her trapped within its walls. Instead, she felt an entirely new sensation. It was a soft, incredibly warm current, like a gentle breeze tugging at the edges of her ethereal gown, beckoning her toward something vast, peaceful, and bright. She turned around, her golden eyes resting on the two mortals sitting amidst the debris. Sophie was leaning against Julian's side, her pastel pink overalls covered in drywall dust, her curls chaotic and tangled. Julian had his arm wrapped securely around her shoulders, looking like a heavily bruised, exhausted lumberjack, who had miraculously survived a natural disaster. "It is time," Eleanor said. Her voice was no longer a chilling, echoing rasp. It was clear, melodic, and startlingly gentle. Sophie sat up straight, her eyes widening as the reality of the words sank in. "Time? What do you mean, time? We just won. We just beat the evil ex-fiancé and reclaimed the apartment. We have to celebrate. I was going to make matcha. I promised you tea." Eleanor offered a soft, wistful smile. She drifted closer, her golden aura casting a warm glow over Sophie's tear-filled eyes. "You have given me something far sweeter than tea, Sophie. You gave me my freedom. The anchor is broken. The curse that held me to this rotting mortal plane has been severed. I am being called forward." Sophie scrambled to her feet, her hands reaching out instinctively, even though she knew she couldn't truly touch the ghost. But you can't leave. Who is going to critique my color palettes? Who is going to complain about my music? Eleanor, you're my roommate." "I was your warden," Eleanor corrected gently, floating mere inches from Sophie. "And then, by some miraculous stroke of your sheer, stubborn lunacy, I became your friend. But I do not belong in this era, Sophie. I have lingered far past my time. I am so very tired, and the light is so incredibly warm." A single tear slipped down Sophie's cheek, cutting a clean track through the soot on her face. She sniffled, aggressively wiping it away with the back of her hand. "I'm going to miss you. You dramatic, loving, wonderful ghost." "And I shall miss you," Eleanor replied, her own ethereal form shimmering with emotion. "Even if your devotion to tranquil sage remains a monumental architectural tragedy." Eleanor turned her gaze to Julian, who had respectfully gotten to his feet, wincing as he stood. The Victorian phantom floated up to him, crossing her arms and narrowing her golden eyes in a return to her classic, haughty form. "Librarian," Eleanor said, her tone sharp and authoritative. "Yes, Lady Eleanor." Julian answered, standing up perfectly straight, looking as though he were being addressed by royalty. "You have proven yourself adequately brave," Eleanor declared, looking him up and down. "However, your bravery does not excuse your general state of disarray. I am entrusting Sophie to your care. If you break her heart, if you cause her to shed a single tear of sorrow, I do not care what plane of existence I am residing in. I will cross the veil of death itself. I will return to this realm, I will freeze the blood in your veins, and I will personally drag you to the underworld by your ankles. Do we have an absolute understanding?" Julian swallowed hard, nodding emphatically. "Crystal clear understanding. I promise to take care of her." "Good," Eleanor sniffed. Then, she raised a translucent hand, gesturing vaguely toward Julian's head. "And for heaven's sake, seek out a barber. Your hair is completely unkempt. You look like a startled bird that has been dragged backward through a hedge." Julian let out a startled, genuine laugh, running a hand through his chaotic, golden brown hair. Startled bird. Got it. I'll book a haircut tomorrow. Eleanor turned back to Sophie. The air in the center of the room began to shift. The ambient golden light intensified, swirling together to form a glowing, radiant archway in the middle of the ruined living room. The scent of blooming roses and warm summer rain flooded the apartment, entirely replacing the smell of dust and destruction. You stayed, Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking with profound gratitude. When the whole world ran away, you stayed with me in the dark. Sophie couldn't hold it back anymore. She stepped forward and threw her arms around the ghost. There was no physical substance to grab onto, no solid body to hold, but as Sophie wrapped her arms around the glowing air, she felt a surge of incredible, overwhelming warmth envelop her. It felt like a perfect, comforting embrace. Thank you, the whisper echoed softly in Sophie's mind. Sophie stepped back, wiping her eyes as Eleanor turned toward the archway of light. The Victorian phantom paused at the threshold. She looked back over her shoulder, her morning gown shifting into a brilliant, shimmering white as the light washed over her. She took in the sight of the messy, imperfect, deeply loved apartment, and the two young mortals standing in the center of it. With one final, dramatic toss of her head, and a radiant, breathtaking smile, Lady Eleanor stepped into the warm, golden light. The archway collapsed inward, folding into a single, brilliant spark before vanishing completely. Apartment 4B was quiet. There were no drafts. There were no cold spots. The overwhelming, crushing presence of the supernatural was completely gone. The apartment was just an apartment again, messy, heavily damaged, and in desperate need of a deep clean. Sophie let out a shaky breath, staring at the empty space where her ghost had just been. Julian stepped up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. He held her tight, letting her lean her weight back against him. She's gone, Sophie whispered, resting her hands over his. She's at peace, Julian murmured softly into her hair. He kissed the side of her head. And honestly, she was right about the haircut. I probably do look like a startled bird. Sophie let out a wet, genuine laugh, turning in his arms to bury her face in his torn flannel shirt. The aesthetic was ruined, the security deposit was likely forfeited, and her favorite pastel mugs were shattered. But as she stood in the ruins of her living room, wrapped in the arms of the sweet librarian, Sophie had never felt more at home. Epilogue, a year later. The morning sun filtered through the pristine glass of the massive bay window, casting a warm, golden pool of light across the scuffed mahogany floorboards of apartment 4B. It was a quiet, lazy Saturday, 1 year and 2 months since the explosive departure of Lady Eleanor, and the complete destruction of the living room. The apartment looked vastly different now. The tranquil sage walls had been painstakingly repaired and repainted, completely erasing the soot, the demonic shadow burns, and the century-old peeling mustard wallpaper. The massive hole Julian had smashed into the kitchen wall with a cast iron skillet was gone. In its place, Julian had spent 3 exhausting weekends building a beautiful, exposed brick archway, fully integrating the old servant's stairwell into the apartment as a quirky, aesthetic storage space for Sophie's overflowing yarn inventory. The space was no longer purely Sophie's pastel, lo-fi sanctuary. It was a harmonious, chaotic blend of 2 lives. Stacks of antique, leather-bound municipal records and architectural history books rested comfortably next to vibrant, overflowing baskets of pink and yellow yay wool. The velvet armchair now had a permanent, cozy indentation from where Julian loved to read, and a beautiful, non-lethal, structurally secure mirror hung firmly on the living room wall. Sophie stood in the kitchen, humming softly to the lo-fi hip-hop beats playing from a brand new, significantly smaller Bluetooth speaker. She wore her favorite oversized beige sweater, her curls tied up in a chaotic bun, looking entirely rested and at peace. She carefully scooped vibrant green powder into her ceramic bowl, adding a splash of hot water, and using her bamboo whisk to froth it into a perfect, bright green foam. She poured the matcha into her favorite pink mug. Then, Sophie reached up to the highest shelf of the cabinet. She pulled down a delicate, gold-rimmed Victorian teacup adorned with painted roses, a piece she had specifically hunted down at a local flea market. She poured a small amount of the steaming green tea into the antique cup, carrying it over to the edge of the matcha station, and setting it down gently. "Good morning, Eleanor," Sophie whispered to the empty, sunlit kitchen. "The aesthetic is holding up nicely today. I think you'd approve." Right on cue, a pair of warm arms wrapped around Sophie's waist from behind. Julian pressed a soft kiss to the side of her neck, bringing with him the comforting scent of cedarwood, fresh coffee, and the sweet strawberry tarts he had picked up from the cafe downstairs. "Who are we talking to?" Julian murmured, his voice thick with sleep. He rested his chin on her shoulder, looking completely at home. True to his promise to the Victorian ghost, his golden brown hair was impeccably styled, trimmed neatly at the sides. He no longer resembled a startled bird dragged through a hedge. "Just keeping up traditions," Sophie smiled, leaning back against his chest. She pointed at the vintage teacup. "I still think she checks in on us sometimes. Just to make sure you aren't wearing distressed denim to the dinner table." Julian laughed, a rich, warm sound that filled the kitchen. He reached past her to grab one of the strawberry tarts from the pink bakery box, taking a bite. "Hey, my genes have been perfectly intact for 12 months. I value my life far too much to risk Lady Eleanor crossing the veil of death to drag me to the underworld by my ankles." Sophie turned around in his arms, stealing a bite of his pastry. "You know, the landlord emailed me yesterday. He asked if I wanted to renew the lease for another year. He sounded genuinely shocked that we haven't broken the contract and fled into the night." "Did you tell him that we fundamentally altered the spiritual ecosystem of his property?" Julian asked, raising an eyebrow playfully. "Or that we technically owe him a massive apology for obliterating his vintage chandelier during a battle with a diarrheal smoke demon?" "I told him the draft finally settled," Sophie grinned, wrapping her arms around his neck. "And that we'll happily sign for another year, provided he doesn't raise the rent." He agreed instantly. "I think he's just terrified of having to find new tenants who are willing to overlook the quirks of the fourth floor." "His loss is our gain," Julian said softly. He looked around the bright, peaceful apartment, his hazel eyes completely devoid of the terror they had experienced a year ago. "I really love this place, Sophie. It feels perfect." "It really does," Sophie agreed. Her small crochet business had exploded in popularity over the last few semesters, allowing her to easily afford her half of the rent without relying on instant ramen. Julian had moved in officially 6 months ago, bringing his books, his power drills, and his endless supply of golden retriever optimism. There were no more bleeding walls, no more localized freezing temperatures, and absolutely no more weird, possessive ghosts hiding her keys. Julian set his half-eaten pastry down on the counter and pulled Sophie fully against him. He began to sway them gently to the rhythm of the lo-fi beat, a slow, completely mundane, and beautifully normal kitchen dance. Sophie rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. For a few minutes, they just swayed in the sunlight, surrounded by the quiet, domestic bliss they had fought so hard to secure. On the edge of the matcha station, the gold-rimmed Victorian teacup sat perfectly still. Suddenly, a faint, incredibly warm breeze swept through the kitchen. It didn't bring the freezing chill of the grave, nor the metallic scent of ozone. It smelled faintly, sweetly, of blooming roses and old paper. The surface of the green tea inside the antique cup rippled perfectly, just once, as if an invisible, elegant finger had gently tapped the rim. Sophie paused her dancing, looking over Julian's shoulder at the teacup. A slow, radiant smile spread across her face. She closed her eyes, pulling Julian a little tighter, and whispered into the quiet room. "We miss you too, Eleanor. You've been watching Horcom After Dark. If this story kept you awake tonight, leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, keep the lights on, or don't. Good night."